A gingerbread cake sat in my left hand. A pumpkin pie sat in my right. I was still standing in the bakery aisle, trying to decide between the two, when I dialed my mother's number to let her pick for me. What came back through the phone wasn't an answer. It was silence, the kind that already knows something you don't, stretched out long enough that I pulled the phone away from my ear just to check the call hadn't dropped. "Oh," she finally said, "we already celebrated. Yesterday." For a second I actually laughed, certain she had to be joking. My father took the phone away from her before I could ask another question. He wasn't interested in cushioning it the way she had tried to. "Everything's easier when you're not here," he told me, in the same flat tone he used for describing traffic. 60 minutes later, I was walking that pumpkin pie into a crowded, overheated room that smelled like burnt coffee and pine, setting the box down in front of a stranger named Ruth Calloway, who looked at it like nobody had ever handed her something without wanting anything back. "Would you want a chance to start over?" I asked her, not yet knowing what that question would unravel in my own life. 3 hours later, my mother's name lit up my phone again. And this time she was shouting about a house she believed I was in the middle of handing her. Keep listening, because that morning didn't end with one bad phone call. It taught me, over an entire year and 3 separate betrayals, the difference between a family that needs you around and one that actually wants you there. If stories like mine are the kind you come back for, hit subscribe so you catch what happens next. None of it arrived with a warning label. No strange text the night before. No gut feeling to brace for anything. I'd woken up outside Cedar Rapids a little before 7, running the same short checklist that showed up every holiday. Finish wrapping the last gift, grab dessert, don't forget my mother's coffee, the dark roast she actually liked. Get there early enough to help. Standing in my kitchen with my coffee cooling in my hand, I had no idea that before the day ended, I would have already made the first of 3 decisions. Decisions that would take a full year, and 3 people who were supposed to love me without conditions, to finally understand. Every holiday season came with the same running checklist in my head before my feet even touched the floor. Finish the last of the gift wrapping, swing by the bakery, don't forget which coffee my mother actually drinks. The dark roast. Never the flavored kind, she said tasted like a scented candle. Get to my parents' place with enough time to help set up before the rest of the family showed up. I had been running some version of that same mental list for years, and it had genuinely never crossed my mind to question why the job had always landed on me. Outside my window, Cedar Rapids sat under that flat gray sky Iowa seemed to specialize in every December, the kind that made even the cheapest strand of porch lights on a neighbor's house look brighter than it deserved to. I started a pot of coffee, pulled my hair into a knot, and glanced at the 2 presents already sitting wrapped by my front door. One of them was barely more than a card, thin and mostly symbolic. The actual gift wasn't something you could wrap. It wasn't something that would fit under any tree at all. 2 months before that morning, I had quietly bought my parents a house. It was a modest, single-level place roughly 15 minutes from where they currently lived, close enough to their doctor's office, a decent grocery store, and a walking path my mother liked because it didn't have the kind of hills that bothered her knees anymore. Nothing about it was extravagant. At a purchase price of $310,000, it wasn't even the largest financial decision I'd made that decade, but the number on the paperwork had never been the point. I had spent more than 10 years living carefully below what I actually earned, banking every bonus instead of spending it, promising myself that all that discipline would eventually turn into something real I could hand to the 2 people who raised me. This was the year that promise finally came due. I bought the house outright, with plans to transfer it into my parents' names right after the holidays, once things had quieted down enough for everyone to actually sit with what was happening instead of just reacting to the excitement of it. My attorney already had the paperwork drafted and ready. Nothing had closed yet. No deed had changed hands. On paper, the house was still entirely mine, but I had already given it away twice over in every way that mattered emotionally. Walking my parents through those empty rooms myself on 2 separate visits, watching them build an entire future out of nothing but square footage and good light. My mother, Diane, had stood in the empty living room with a tape measure stretched taut between her hands, debating curtain lengths, wondering out loud whether the dining table would look better catching the morning sun near the bay window. My father, Harold, had picked out the corner of the second bedroom for himself, joking that he was finally old enough to admit he wanted a proper reading chair after decades of pretending he didn't need one. Watching the two of them imagine a life they hadn't lived yet had honestly felt like half the gift to me. I assumed the other half would come later. Watching their faces the day we made it all official on paper, I had spent most of my adult life being the one who kept my family running smoothly. Nobody had ever formally handed me that job. It had simply built up over the years, one small responsibility at a time, until being the fixer became something everyone assumed about me without ever discussing it out loud. I was the one who remembered Aunt Paulette couldn't touch anything with pecans in it. I tracked what time my sister Kristen got off her shift at the accounting firm, which restaurants still took last-minute reservations 2 days before a holiday, whether my mother owned enough serving dishes for a table of 12 instead of the usual 8. I showed up early and stayed until the last dish was dried. If 2 relatives weren't speaking that year over some old grudge, I quietly split them up at opposite ends of the table before anyone had to ask. None of that ever registered as sacrifice while I was in the middle of doing it. It felt more like proof that I had a permanent place in that family, that the effort I put in actually mattered to somebody. About a week before Christmas, during a short call about whether I should pick up an extra gift or 2, my mother had said something that barely registered at the time. "Kristen could really use the money more than you'd guess," she said, completely out of nowhere, with nothing attached to explain it. I remember thinking it was a strange thing to bring up in the middle of a conversation about wrapping paper, and then I remember letting it slide, the way you let most offhand comments slide during a busy week. I never asked what she meant by it. She never offered anything further. The sentence simply drifted past and disappeared underneath everything else on my plate that day. I finished my coffee, checked the wrapped presents by the door one last time, and grabbed my coat off the hook. The house transfer was still happening, as far as I knew that morning. The only real question left in front of me was which dessert to bring, and standing there in my kitchen, it felt like the smallest decision I would have to make all day. The grocery store was already crowded by the time I got to the desserts, carts squeaking past each other. Someone's radio in the ceiling speakers playing a tinny version of a carol I couldn't quite place. I had a gingerbread cake in one hand, a pumpkin pie balanced against my hip, and my phone pinned between my ear and my shoulder while I waited for my mother to pick up. She answered on the 4th ring, distracted, like she'd been in the middle of something. I asked her the question I'd been meaning to ask all morning. Which dessert? She went quiet, and it wasn't the kind of quiet that meant she was thinking it over. It was the kind that meant she was choosing her next words carefully, the way you choose words you already know are going to land badly. "We already celebrated," she said finally, "yesterday." I actually laughed out loud, standing there between the cakes and the bread aisle, certain for a second that this had to be some kind of joke. A setup for a punchline about opening presents early because Kristen had stopped by, or eating half the ham on Christmas Eve the way we sometimes did. I asked her what she meant. She told me, in the same even tone she used for confirming a doctor's appointment, that everyone had already been together the night before, so they'd simply gone ahead and done dinner and gifts then. Convenience. she called it. Like the whole holiday had drifted along by itself with me somewhere off to the side, and it hadn't crossed a single person's mind to mention it until every plate was already scraped clean and stacked in the dishwasher. For a moment, I actually tried to make the math work in my head, the way you do when a number on a receipt looks wrong and you assume the mistake has to be yours. Maybe there had been a scheduling conflict I'd missed. Maybe someone's shift had changed at the last minute and the family had scrambled to adjust without anyone thinking to loop me in first. I ran through every version of an accident I could invent, because an accident was easier to hold than what I actually suspected was sitting underneath her careful doctor's appointment voice. My knuckles went white around the cake box. You planned this without telling me. That was the only question that actually mattered. I heard the phone change hands before my father's voice replaced hers, and unlike her, he wasn't interested in softening anything on the way down. Everything's easier when you're not here, he said, flat, like he was reading off a grocery list. The fluorescent lights above the bakery case suddenly felt too harsh. Somewhere behind me, a toddler was begging his mother for one of the frosted cookies stacked in the glass case, and a cart rattled past, loaded down with wrapping paper. The store kept right on being ordinary and festive around me while my father explained, in a handful of clipped sentences, that I'd gotten difficult to be around lately. That I questioned things, corrected people, made every gathering feel heavier than it needed to be. They'd wanted one easy holiday, he said, like it was a reasonable request, instead of a decision they'd already made without me weeks earlier. I didn't try to talk him out of it. I didn't remind him of every holiday I'd planned down to the last detail, or the dishes I'd thrown together from scratch at 11 at night because someone forgot to order enough food. I didn't bring up the house at all. That surprised me even as it was happening, because normally I'd already be 3 steps into fixing whatever misunderstanding I assumed this had to be. Instead, I just stood there holding a cake nobody wanted anymore, listening, until there was genuinely nothing left for either of us to say. When the call finally ended, I stayed rooted in that aisle long enough that a stranger had to reach past me for a bag of dinner rolls, murmuring a quiet "excuse me, I barely registered." I set the pumpkin pie back on the shelf, gently, the way you'd set down something you already knew was broken. My hands weren't shaking. That was the strangest part. How steady they were while everything else in me had come loose. I kept the gingerbread cake in my cart and finished the shopping trip anyway, because apparently my body had decided that was easier than figuring out what came next. The cashier wished me a Merry Christmas at the register. I thanked her on autopilot, the way you thank someone for holding a door. Out in the parking lot, I loaded my bags into the trunk, propped the cake box against the console beside me, and dropped into the driver's seat without touching the key. My parents' wrapped gifts were still back there next to the groceries. The thin envelope meant for the house transfer sat tucked in my purse, suddenly useless, a promise about a future that had apparently already been rewritten without asking me. For years I had always known exactly where I was supposed to show up on Christmas morning. Now there was only a cake with nowhere to go, and a parking lot full of people who clearly did. Somewhere off to my left, 2 kids chased each other between the cart corrals, one of them shrieking with laughter loud enough to carry through my closed window. A woman a few spaces down was wrestling a folded stroller into her trunk while balancing a phone against her shoulder. And for a second I envied her completely. The ordinary chaos of her morning, the fact that whatever she was juggling still had somewhere to arrive. I sat there long enough that the windshield started to fog faintly at the edges from my own breathing, and I let it, watching the gray sky blur into something even flatter through the haze. I started the car and pulled out without picking a direction. I drove without picking a direction, which was not something I normally did. I was a person who always knew where she was going, even when she didn't want to admit it out loud. But that morning I just followed the plowed streets past storefronts that were dark for the holiday, past a gas station with its lights still on and nobody at the pumps, until the road curved by a community center my company had donated supplies to during a winter drive 2 years earlier. A banner outside, a little crooked on one side where the wind had worked a zip tie loose, announced a Christmas meal for families in transitional housing. I knew there was a shelter program connected to it somewhere behind that building, though I had never actually been inside. I almost kept driving. My hands were already moving to signal back onto the main road when I glanced at the pumpkin pie sitting on the passenger seat. Still boxed, still untouched, still smelling faintly of cinnamon through the cardboard. Nobody was waiting for that pie. Nobody was waiting for me either. Not in the way I had assumed they would be an hour earlier. I turned the wheel before I'd fully decided to. My plan, such as it was, amounted to almost nothing. Leave the dessert at the front desk. Say something kind to whoever was working the door. Go home and figure out what a person does with the rest of a ruined Christmas. I carried the box in through a set of double doors into a room that was warm, in a way my own apartment rarely managed to be. Thick with the smell of coffee, roasted turkey, and the sharp, clean sting of industrial cleaner underneath it all. Paper snowflakes, cut a little unevenly, had been taped along one wall in a crooked garland. A volunteer near the entrance checked that the box was sealed before she took it from me, thanked me twice, and carried it toward a row of folding tables covered in foil trays and mismatched serving spoons. That was when I noticed the woman standing a few feet away, near a table stacked with donated coats and blankets. She looked to be somewhere in her 60s, dressed neatly in a blouse under a coat that had clearly seen more than one winter, one hand resting on the handle of a bag of folded clothing like she wasn't entirely sure yet whether it belonged to her or to someone else in line. She wasn't watching the volunteer carry my pie away with any particular longing. She was simply watching it the way you'd watch something ordinary happen in an ordinary world, which, on that particular morning, struck me as the most remarkable thing I had seen all day. Nobody in my family would have looked at a dessert box like that. Not with surprise, not with anything close to gratitude that didn't come wrapped in expectation. I introduced myself before I had decided to do that either. Her name was Ruth Calloway. She had a steady voice, tired around the edges but not defeated, and she thanked me for the pie without the kind of performance people sometimes put on when they think a stranger's generosity requires an audience. I asked, mostly to keep from standing there in silence, how long she'd been coming to the center. She told me, plainly, the way you'd explain a broken furnace or a delayed flight. She had worked in the front office of a high school for almost 18 years. Her husband had gotten sick 2 years ago, and by the time the cancer took him that spring, the medical bills had taken almost everything else. She had savings, for a while. Then she didn't. She was staying in a transitional shelter program a few blocks from where we stood, waiting on a disability claim to clear, working part-time wherever she could find hours that didn't conflict with her caseworker appointments. She told me all of this without asking for anything in return, and something about that steadiness cracked something open in me that the phone call in the bakery aisle hadn't managed to touch. "Do you want a fresh start?" I asked her. I heard how strange the question sounded the moment it left my mouth, standing there in a room full of donated coats. A woman I'd known for 4 minutes. I clarified quickly that I wasn't offering her a house, or a check, or anything I couldn't actually follow through on. My company had connections to a few transitional housing groups, I told her, and if it would help, I could look into whether anything better than her current arrangement might be available. Ruth didn't take the offer at face value, and I liked her more for that. She asked sensible questions. Whether the programs I meant were legitimate, whether looking into one would put the support she already had at risk. I didn't have the answers yet, so I told her the truth, That I would find out rather than pretend I already knew. That honesty seemed to matter to her more than any promise would have. Back in my car a few minutes later, I noticed how bare the seat beside me looked without that pie box sitting on it. It was already someone else's dessert now, somewhere behind those double doors, instead of the leftover symbol of the Christmas I'd lost that morning. I didn't start the engine right away. I just sat there with both hands on the wheel, staring out at a sky the color of wet concrete. And for the first time since the bakery aisle, I let myself actually think through what I wanted to do about the house. My attorney's office was obviously closed for the holiday, and I couldn't picture any world where she'd step away from her own family's dinner table to handle paperwork for me. So instead, sitting right there in the parking lot, I pulled up our old email thread on my phone and typed out a short note pulling back my consent on the transfer. No further closing steps, no deed delivery, not until I said so directly. Then, just to be safe, I dialed the office number and repeated the same instruction into their voicemail, word for word. So there could never be any argument later about the exact moment I'd changed course. I read the message back to myself twice before I hit send, half expecting my own hands to talk me out of it. They didn't. There was something almost clinical about the process. Drafting language I'd normally only use for vendor disputes at work, and that clinical distance was the only thing keeping me from crying in a grocery store parking lot on Christmas Day. The legal confirmation could wait until the office reopened. My parents could not. Then I called my mother. I kept it brief, the way you keep a difficult conversation brief when lingering on it will only make things worse. I explained that the transfer wasn't happening the way we'd planned, and that she and my father needed to stop building plans around a house that wasn't theirs yet. I mentioned the shelter, and that I was seriously weighing whether the property should go toward a transitional housing program instead. Nothing was promised. Nothing was decided beyond that one point. I just wasn't willing to hand it over on the timeline I'd set that morning. Not anymore. My mother was quiet for a beat too long, and I could hear the particular kind of silence that meant she was recalculating something in real time. "Vivian, you can't just give away our house to strangers." The word slipped out before she could catch it. Our house. I sat there in my car with the engine still off, my breath fogging up the windshield a little more with every exhale, and let the silence stretch out instead of rushing to fill it the way I usually did. She backtracked almost instantly, insisting she'd only meant the house she assumed was already earmarked for them, the one they'd spent months building an entire retirement around. The correction didn't undo what she'd already said, though, if anything, it confirmed that the first version had been sitting there under the surface the whole time, just waiting for a careless enough moment to slip loose. "It was never your house." "Mom," I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Somehow that seemed to make her angrier than shouting would have. She circled back to Christmas then, insisting I was turning one scheduling decision into a punishment for the entire family, that everyone had simply wanted a quieter evening this year. As she tried to explain why the earlier gathering had made sense, she let something else slip, something she clearly hadn't meant to say out loud. They'd decided the weekend before, not the night before, the way she'd first told me. Not some spontaneous decision that came together because everyone happened to already be in the same room. The weekend before. "We figured you'd move past it eventually," she said. That landed differently than my father's line had. His cruelty in the bakery aisle had been blunt and immediate. A door slammed shut in one motion. Hers was worse in a quieter way because it meant she had known ahead of time that leaving me out would hurt me, and she had penciled my eventual forgiveness into their planning the same way you'd pad a project timeline for an expected delay. Something to route around rather than avoid. I ended the call before she could drag us into another argument about the house. Before the old, familiar cycle could start grinding forward again, the one where I explained myself. She got defensive, and somehow by the end of it I was the one apologizing for having feelings about any of it in the first place. I sat with the phone still warm in my hand for a moment after the line went dead, replaying that word. Figured. The way you'd replay a wrong note in a song you knew by heart. Figured implied a calculation, a weighing of costs, somewhere in my mother's mind. My hurt feelings had been one line item on a list that also included convenience, and the convenience had won without much of a contest. I sat in that parking lot for a long time after the call ended, watching my own breath fog and clear on the glass. My mother had known for days. My father had known. Whoever else had been at that dinner table had known too, sitting there eating and laughing while my chair stayed empty on purpose. Christmas hadn't happened without me because anyone forgot to call. Someone had made a decision, and everyone else had simply stepped into it without asking a single question. What I didn't know yet, sitting there in that parking lot with my hands finally starting to shake, was how many of them had known exactly how it would feel to be me on the other end of that silence. I put the car in reverse without any real plan for where I was headed. Just a low, steady need to be moving instead of sitting still with everything I'd just heard. The radio came on automatically when the engine turned over, some cheerful station still cycling through carols, and I let it play without really listening. The tinny brass and sleigh bells drifting past me like weather. Somewhere behind that noise, I was already doing the math on who else at that table had known, and how long they'd all managed to sit across from an empty chair without a single one of them reaching for their phone. For the next several days, I did almost nothing. I let my phone light up without answering it, watching the names cycle across the screen in a pattern I could have predicted without looking. My mother's name, my father's name, my mother's name again. I didn't need to pick up to know roughly what was being said on the other end. Passed from one relative to the next like a game of telephone nobody had asked to play. My mother telling my father I still wasn't picking up. My father telling Kristen I was being dramatic again. Somebody deciding, somewhere in one of those calls, that I would eventually calm down, the way I always did, and that the calming down was simply a matter of time. I went back into the office instead, into a building that emptied out completely in the stretch of dead days after the holiday. Most of my coworkers away, and the handful who weren't checking their phones more than their inboxes, I threw myself into closing out year-end reports and chasing down overdue vendor renewals, anything with a clean, solvable shape to it, until the columns of numbers in front of me started to feel more trustworthy than any single person in my family. Numbers didn't rearrange themselves after the fact to sound better. Numbers didn't tell you one story on the phone and a completely different one behind your back. But every time my screen lit up, I found myself circling back to the same question. If my family genuinely believed I had made other plans for Christmas, the way my father had implied, then somebody at some point would have mentioned those plans to me directly. Nobody had, not once, in any conversation leading up to that day, had a single person in my family asked what I was doing for the holiday, because nobody needed to ask. They already knew. They had simply decided not to include me in knowing it too. That answer arrived on a Monday afternoon, in the form of a phone call from my Aunt Paulette, weeks before any of this had happened. I'd picked out a set of specialty teas she'd once mentioned liking, wrapped them myself, and shoved the box onto the top shelf of my hall closet alongside every other present I still hadn't found the will to deliver. When she called that Monday, her voice carried a particular kind of awkwardness. the sound of someone who had just realized she'd been standing inside something without fully understanding its shape until well after the fact. Paulette explained that she'd asked about me the moment the earlier date started making the rounds among the family. She knew organizing usually fell to me, and it had struck her as odd that I wasn't involved in planning something that size. My mother, according to her, had waved the question off almost immediately, saying I had my own plans that year, that everyone should simply enjoy having the evening free while they could. None of it had come together the way my mother first described to me, some spontaneous convenience born of everyone happening to already be in the same room. The new date had been circulating for days beforehand, quietly, on purpose, with a tidy explanation for my absence already prepared and ready to hand out the moment anyone asked. I perched on the edge of my couch while she talked, the wrapped tea set balanced on the coffee table where I could see it, corners still crisp. Paulette would never know I'd already bought her gift, that it had been sitting there the entire time she was learning she'd unknowingly helped cover for my absence. My apartment looked exactly the way it always did around me. The throw blanket still folded over the arm of the chair, one mug drying on the rack, a short stack of unopened work mail by the door. Nothing in that room had physically changed, and yet the whole shape of my Christmas had shifted again, for the second time in 3 days. My father had told me, standing in a grocery store, that everything was easier without me there. My mother had admitted, on the phone in a parking lot, that they had expected me to eventually get over being left out. Now I understood something worse than either of those two things on its own. My mother hadn't merely gone along with a decision my father made somewhere upstream of her. She had actively authored a story to cover my absence and distributed it to the rest of the family well ahead of time, smoothing the whole thing over so completely that it hadn't occurred to a single relative to send even a quick message checking in on me that night. Paulette apologized more than once before we said goodbye, her voice shrinking a little with each round of it. I could hear how bad she felt, and I honestly didn't have room to carry her guilt on top of everything else that week. I let her know I appreciated her honesty, and I wrapped up the call before it could tip over into something neither of us actually needed it to become. That evening, I sat with the shape of it for a long time. Not the sting of being excluded anymore, exactly. Something colder underneath that. My family hadn't simply celebrated Christmas without me by accident, the way an overlooked detail slips through the cracks of a busy week. They had arranged themselves around me the way you'd arrange furniture around an object you'd already decided didn't belong in the room, quietly, efficiently, and without a single conversation that ever included my voice in the deciding. I stayed up later than I should have that night, turning the whole week over in my head like a stone I kept flipping to find a smoother side. There wasn't one. Every angle I looked at it from led back to the same conclusion, that my mother hadn't reacted to a hard situation so much as managed one, the way she'd once managed a difficult relative's seating chart, or a stubborn stain on the good tablecloth, methodically and without much room left over for how it might land on the person being managed. Kristen showed up at my door on a Tuesday evening without calling first, which told me almost everything before she opened her mouth. Nobody in my family dropped by unannounced. Somebody had either sent her or she'd talked herself into coming on her own. And either way, it meant this visit had a purpose behind it that had nothing to do with catching up. I noticed her hands right away, restless in a way that didn't match the calm expression she'd put on for the hallway, fidgeting with a button on her coat even after she'd hung it on my hook by the door. I made 2 cups of coffee and set hers down without saying much, letting her get to whatever she'd come to say in her own time instead of pulling it out of her. She started with our mother's version of events, the same story Aunt Paulette had already unraveled for me days earlier. Everyone believed I'd made plans of my own that year. Kristen had pictured me at some coworkers' party. Maybe. Or out with friends from the gym. Filling in the blank with whatever seemed plausible enough not to question further. At one point, she admitted, almost sheepishly, that it had struck her as strange in the moment. Me not lifting a finger to help organize a dinner that size, since organizing had always fallen to me by default. But the dinner itself had swept her along. She said, the way a moving crowd sweeps you toward an exit you weren't necessarily heading for, and she'd taken the path that asked the least of her. Then she pivoted, the way I'd expected her to eventually, back toward the house. She still believed I'd overreacted about the transfer. That was the piece she couldn't seem to let go of. No matter how many times our conversation wandered somewhere else, always circling back to it like a tongue returning to a sore tooth. She understood. She insisted. That Christmas had genuinely hurt me. But in her mind, that pain belonged in a separate drawer entirely from the house, which she filed under practical matters, furniture arrangements, retirement logistics, the particular excitement our parents had shown while picturing a future neither of them had earned yet. She couldn't quite see, and I didn't have the energy to make her see it that evening, that treating those two things as unrelated was precisely what had allowed everyone around that table to separate my generosity from my feelings in the first place, as though one could be kept and the other discarded without consequence. I let the house argument die on its own rather than fighting it a second time. Instead, I asked her something simpler. Did you notice I wasn't there? Her fingers went still against the button she'd been worrying at. Whatever answer she might have tried to construct arrived too late, because her face had already given it away. Of course she'd noticed. For years I'd been the one who walked in carrying bags in both hands, checking the oven unasked, rearranging chairs and topping off drinks before anyone thought to request one. A room built around that kind of presence doesn't simply forget the shape of it once the presence is gone, whether or not a single person says a name out loud to explain the difference. Kristen finally admitted it, quietly. That, yes, she'd clocked my absence almost immediately. She'd just chosen to accept the explanation on offer and go on eating, because pulling at that particular thread in the middle of dinner would have made the whole evening harder for everyone still sitting there. That admission cost me more than her earlier defensiveness ever could have. I glanced toward my hall closet, where a small stack of wrapped presents sat waiting, hers among them, still sealed, still without a delivery date. Then I asked her the question that had been sitting in my chest since Paulette's call. If you all genuinely thought I had other plans, why didn't a single person text me Merry Christmas? Kristen's gaze dropped to the table. There wasn't a version of that fact she could dress up into something innocent. They had opened presents together. They had eaten an entire meal together. Somebody had taken photos that would surface months later in a holiday recap somewhere, and the whole group had apparently discussed me enough collectively to settle on the idea that I was elsewhere that night. Perfectly fine, needing no follow-up. And still, out of that entire room, not one relative had bothered to send the kind of message you'd send a stranger from a customer service line, just to confirm somebody's holiday was going okay. Her shoulders dropped a little further. She said, quietly, that she genuinely hadn't thought about the missing texts until I'd said it out loud just now, sitting at my table with her coffee gone cold in front of her, and I believed every word of it. That was somehow the hardest part to sit with. It hadn't been calculated cruelty on Kristen's end. It was something duller and, in its own way, more damning than cruelty would have been. Proof that the whole family had grown so used to my presence being guaranteed that checking on me had simply stopped registering as a task worth doing, without anyone ever consciously choosing to let it slide. A silence settled over the kitchen after that, long enough that I watched Kristen's eyes drift back toward the closet again, something shifting behind her face like a memory being turned over and examined from a new angle for the first time. She changed the subject the way people do, when they'd rather not sit inside a hard moment any longer than necessary, mentioning, almost as an afterthought, that Neil had been such a help lately managing Grandma Opal's banking. She said it with a note of relief threaded through her voice, like good news tucked inside an otherwise difficult conversation. And then asked, in the same breath, whether I had any of that cinnamon coffee left in the cabinet. I told her I did, and let the comment about Neil pass without any reaction at all, though something about the particular relief in her voice when she said it stayed lodged in my memory long after the rest of that evening had faded. I ended up at the house the next morning without really deciding to go there. One minute I was drinking coffee at home, and the next I was pulling into the driveway, engine still running, staring at the brick walkway and the frost clinging to the edges of the lawn. The bay window my mother had fallen for on sight caught the gray morning light in a way that made the whole front of the house look almost staged. The rooms behind it were empty only in the technical sense. In every other sense, they were still packed full of everything my parents had spent 2 visits imagining into them. I let myself see it clearly, standing there in the cold. My mother, with a tape measure, stretched taut across those windows, debating curtain lengths to nobody in particular. My father claiming the far corner of the second bedroom, laughing about finally being old enough to admit he wanted a reading chair. Watching them furnish a life in their heads had been half the reason I'd wanted to buy the place. What I hadn't clocked until I stood there alone was how much their language had drifted across those 2 afternoons. The first time through, my mother referred to it as the house I was handing over to them. By the second visit, without either of us marking the change, it had quietly turned into their retirement place, spoken like something already settled and owned. Somewhere in that small shift, gratitude had been replaced by possession, and I had mistaken the whole transformation for enthusiasm. In the kitchen, a thin pencil line marked the wall near the corner cabinet. Left from when my father measured out space for a coffee station he'd talked about building himself. I traced it with my thumb without meaning to, and something clicked into place that the phone call 3 days earlier hadn't fully let me understand. I finally saw how my mother had been able to say our house without hearing anything wrong in it. In their minds, the move had already happened. The paperwork was just a formality catching up to a decision they'd made for themselves months ago. My phone buzzed on the counter. My father's name lit the screen. I let it ring once before I picked up. He skipped the greeting. He wanted to talk in person, he said, because calls kept making things worse between us. I nearly laughed at how familiar that line sounded. For 3 straight days, my family had treated this like a mood that would dissolve if someone could just get me alone in a room and talk long enough. I gave him the address. He showed up 20 minutes later, fast enough that he must have started driving before we'd even hung up. The first thing he did, stepping through the door, was scan the living room like a man checking whether anything had moved behind his back. His eyes caught, briefly, on the bare corner where his reading chair had once been imagined into existence. Then he pulled off his gloves, folded them, and tucked them into his coat pocket. A small, unconscious gesture that told me more than his words would that whole morning. Some part of him still felt entirely at home in that house. He had never once stopped believing it already belonged to him. He opened with an accusation that I was weaponizing money, that gifts weren't supposed to arrive with strings attached, that yanking the house back over hurt feelings made the whole gesture look calculated. I let him finish without cutting in, which surprised us both. A year earlier, I'd have jumped straight into defending myself. Instead, I watched him circle a living room that legally belonged to nobody but me, informing me I'd turned ownership into something conditional. Once he ran out of steam, I told him there had never been one condition tied to that house. I hadn't demanded public gratitude, or a say in the furniture, or a guaranteed seat at every future holiday. All I had assumed, apparently foolishly, was that my parents wanted me present for Christmas. If he needed to call that a condition, fine. It was the only one that had ever existed. His jaw set hard. Christmas and the house were separate matters entirely, he insisted. And the simplicity of that claim told me more than another hour of arguing could have. In his version of events, my presence could be subtracted from the holiday while the gift stayed untouched on the other side of the ledger, as though the two had never been connected. He saw no contradiction in deciding I'd made the day unpleasant while still expecting the biggest gift of my life to land in his hands anyway. I looked past him toward the bay window, picturing my mother and her tape measure again. I had wanted to give them that house. That was what made his accusation land so wrong, somewhere between my wanting to give it and his expecting to receive it. The gift had curdled into an obligation, and any gratitude attached to it had evaporated. Because in his mind, I was only ever fulfilling a role that came standard with being their daughter. I asked him, directly, whether he understood the difference between choosing to give someone something and being informed you were owed it. He brushed the question off as one more example of the tone he claimed I'd brought into every conversation lately. The corrections and boundaries that used to pass without comment. Then I turned to face him and asked the one question I actually needed answered. Did the house come up at dinner that night? Something moved across his expression, subtle enough that a week earlier I might have missed it. His eyes slid away from mine toward the kitchen doorway. He pivoted into a monologue about retirement instead. About how much simpler single-story living would be as he and my mother aged. About how pulling the house back had forced them to rethink a plan they'd already considered finished. He never circled back to actually answer me. I let the silence stretch long enough for him to understand I'd noticed the gap where his answer should have been. Then picked up my keys and told him I was done discussing the house for the day. Kristen called back that same afternoon, and something in the very first word out of her mouth told me the last 24 hours had changed something in her. Gone was the careful, defensive edge that usually crept into her voice whenever a conversation drifted anywhere near our parents. She'd spent the day turning over the question I'd asked her. She said, replaying the dinner itself the way you rewind a scene looking for a detail you'd skipped past the first time through. She had remembered something. Partway through the meal, before the plates were even cleared, my father had stood up with his glass raised and made a toast. Kristen couldn't recall his exact wording, and I didn't push her to reconstruct every syllable, because the part that mattered had stuck with her clearly enough on its own. By next Christmas, he'd told the table, we'll be hosting everyone at our own place. Glasses had gone up around the room in response. Someone. She thought maybe Aunt Paulette had offered a congratulations. The kind you'd give someone celebrating a promotion or an engagement. They had raised a toast to the house. My house. The one still sitting entirely in my name on paper. The one I'd spent more than a decade of careful, deliberate saving to be able to hand over. The one none of them had any legal claim to whatsoever. I lowered myself onto the floor of that empty living room once the call ended, my spine flat against the wall directly under the bay window, the phone still warm against my palm from the conversation. I didn't try to invent details nobody had actually given me. I didn't know who'd been sitting where at that table, or what had been served first, or whether the toast came before or after presents. I only had the one fact Kristen had handed me, and somehow that single fact was enough on its own to rearrange everything I thought I'd already understood about that entire week. My family hadn't simply gathered for a Christmas they'd deliberately hidden from me. My mother had told our extended relatives I had other plans. My father had stood glass in the air and toasted a future built inside a house I hadn't even finished giving them. And everyone seated at that table had celebrated right along with him. Not one person pausing long enough to wonder where I actually was that night, or whether the thing being toasted had ever technically, legally become theirs to celebrate in the first place. Somewhere behind the wall, the building's heating system clicked on, the only sound in that whole quiet room for a long stretch. Up until that phone call, I had assumed my family's worst offense was simply enjoying a holiday without me in it, a thoughtless, selfish choice made in the name of convenience. Now I understood something colder underneath that. They hadn't merely tolerated my absence for one evening. They had been entirely willing, apparently even comfortable, celebrating the exact gift I had given them without requiring the person who gave it to be anywhere in the building. I thought about the pencil mark on that kitchen wall, the one my father had left while measuring for a coffee station in a house that still wasn't legally his. I thought about my mother's tape measure stretched taut across those front windows on 2 separate afternoons, narrating curtains for a future she'd already started describing out loud to people who weren't me. None of those individual memories changed. Exactly, sitting there on that cold, empty floor. What changed was what they added up to mean. I hadn't bought that house because my parents needed shelter from anything. I had bought it because I loved them, because I wanted my father to stop worrying about the stairs in his current place as he aged, because I wanted my mother to finally have the sunlit kitchen she'd been describing to me for years. As far as I was concerned, it had been the clearest way I knew how to say I love you, and I want what's ahead of you to be a little easier to carry. Now, every time I pictured myself actually finishing that transfer, all I could see was my father lifting a glass to a future he had deliberately excluded me from witnessing in person. The house hadn't turned into a weapon in my mind, and I had no interest in making it one. But the meaning behind the gesture had shifted completely, and sitting alone in that empty room while the winter light slid slowly across the bare hardwood floor, I finally understood that I no longer wanted to complete that transfer the way I'd originally intended. I stayed on that floor much longer than I needed to, long enough that the light through the bay window went from pale gray to something dimmer, almost blue, the kind of late afternoon color that shows up in December whether or not anyone is paying attention to it. My knees had gone stiff against the hardwood, and I didn't move to fix that either, because moving felt like it would require deciding something, and I wasn't ready yet to decide anything beyond simply sitting there and letting the new shape of the week settle over me. At some point I noticed my own reflection faintly in the dark window glass across the room, a pale smear of a shape with no real features to it from that distance. And it struck me as an oddly accurate description of how I felt in that moment. Present in the house, present in the family, and somehow, at the exact same time, entirely optional to both. A week later, I went back to the shelter, this time without any dessert in hand, without any real excuse either beyond the fact that I hadn't stopped thinking about the place since I'd left it. The lobby looked different in daylight than it had on Christmas afternoon. Quieter. The paper snowflakes still taped crookedly along one wall, but the crowd of volunteers long gone. I asked the staff at the front desk about their transitional housing partnerships, the more formal programs that existed beyond the emergency meal services and the donation drives I'd walked into by accident. I wanted to understand how families actually got selected, how long a typical placement lasted, and what kind of support came bundled with a stable address once somebody finally had one to their name. I made one thing clear from the start, both to myself and to the coordinator I spoke with. I wasn't there asking anyone to select Ruth Calloway because I happened to have met her on Christmas Day with a pumpkin pie in my hands. If I moved forward with using the house this way, the program itself would decide who qualified, based on whatever criteria they normally used, not on a personal connection I'd made once in a room full of donated coats. If I let my own feelings choose the family, I told the coordinator, I would just be trading one kind of control for another. And I had already spent one Christmas learning exactly what that felt like from the other side. The coordinator walked me through several established organizations. One in particular used single-family homes for placements lasting roughly 9 to 12 months, during which families worked with an assigned case manager, maintained steady employment or active job searches, built up savings toward a security deposit, and prepared step by step for permanent housing somewhere down the line. The property owner retained legal title the entire time, while the nonprofit itself handled screening, day-to-day management, and the paperwork that came with all of it. It sounded, in a strange way, like exactly the kind of structure I had once imagined for my parents. Ownership that stayed with me, purpose that belonged to someone else. I took the materials home that evening, spread them out across my kitchen table, and started reading through the fine print with the same care I'd have used reviewing a contract at work. There would be inspections, insurance changes, a written agreement outlining exactly what the nonprofit could and couldn't do with the property. None of it could happen quickly. And strangely, that slowness reassured me more than anything else could have that week. Christmas had forced one immediate, painful decision out of me. Whatever came after that deserved more care than a single afternoon of grief could provide. I ran into Ruth again almost by accident. On my way out of the building after that first conversation with the coordinator, she was sitting near the front window with a folder of paperwork on her lap. Waiting, she told me, for a job interview scheduled later that afternoon at a medical office downtown. She didn't ask why I'd come back, and I didn't offer an explanation beyond saying I'd been looking into a few programs for a friend at work. It wasn't a lie exactly. It just wasn't the whole truth yet, and I wasn't ready to hand her a piece of hope I couldn't guarantee would actually reach her. She looked steadier than she had a week earlier, in a way that had nothing to do with her circumstances and everything to do with the fact that she was moving forward inside them, instead of simply enduring them. I told her I hoped the interview went well. She thanked me, and for a moment neither of us mentioned Christmas at all, which felt, oddly, like exactly the right way to leave it. By the time I left the building that afternoon, the paperwork for the house had already been submitted into the program's formal screening pipeline. No longer a private decision sitting only in my head, but a real process with real steps that would move forward, whether or not I second-guessed it later that night. Driving home, I found myself doing the math on it without meaning to, the way you sometimes solve a problem in the background while your attention is somewhere else entirely. 9 to 12 months, a case manager, savings goals tracked against a security deposit. It was such a specific, unglamorous kind of structure. Nothing like the sweeping gesture I'd originally pictured when I first stood in that empty living room imagining my parents' curtains. And yet something about its specificity felt more honest than the original plan ever had. My parents' gift had been built entirely on my own assumptions about what they needed. This program, whoever it eventually helped, had been built on evidence, on actual case files and actual outcomes, on people whose job it was to get the details right instead of just meaning well. I got home before dark, which felt notable only because so little that week had followed any kind of normal schedule. I made dinner for one, ate it standing at the counter instead of sitting down, and thought, not for the first time, that grief and forward motion could apparently share the same body without canceling each other out. I thought, too, about Ruth's steady voice describing the interview she had waiting for her that afternoon. The quiet confidence in it, nothing like the woman I'd handed a pie to a week earlier. Whatever came of the screening process, whoever the program eventually chose, I wanted that same kind of forward motion for someone. It didn't have to be her specifically. That was the part I kept reminding myself of, standing there at my counter with a fork in my hand and half my attention still back in that lobby. The wanting itself had to be bigger than any one name attached to it, or it wasn't really generosity at all. It was just another version of choosing who got to matter to me, dressed up to look like something else. My mother called about 3 weeks later, her voice bright and deliberately casual in the way it always was when she wanted to test whether the ground between us had stabilized enough to stand on again. She wanted to put together a family lunch sometime in January. Nothing formal, just everyone getting together while the holidays were still fresh enough to feel like a reason. She wasn't sure yet which weekend worked best. My father disliked one of the restaurants she was considering. Kristen's schedule had gotten complicated again since the new year started. Aunt Paulette would need enough advance notice to arrange a ride, since her eyesight had gotten worse over the winter, and she preferred not to drive after dark. For a moment, listening to her lay all of that out the way she always used to, I felt myself sliding back into the old rhythm without deciding to. My fingers actually moved toward my laptop, halfway to opening a calendar before I stopped myself and set my hand back down on the counter. I told her, as gently as I could manage, that she should choose whatever date and restaurant worked best for her, and let me know afterward if she wanted me there. The silence on her end lasted just long enough to register as confusion, before it curdled into something closer to hurt. She said I was being cold about it. I let that land without rushing to soften it the way I would have a year earlier. For most of my adult life, tasks like that one had simply drifted toward me without anyone ever having to ask directly. The way water finds the lowest point in a room without anyone steering it there. Somewhere over the years, I had taught my family to expect exactly that kind of ease from me, just as surely as they had taught me to keep supplying it without being asked. This time, I let her disappointment stay hers to carry, instead of automatically picking it up the way I always used to. The lunch happened on the second Saturday of January, at a restaurant my mother chose herself, on a date she picked without consulting me at all. It went less smoothly than any holiday gathering I could remember organizing. My mother gave 2 people 2 different starting times by mistake, so Aunt Paulette arrived a full 20 minutes late, flustered and apologizing for something that wasn't actually her fault. My father assumed my mother had called ahead about seating for 8, while my mother assumed he had handled it, and nobody remembered until they were standing at the hostess stand that Kristen had gone dairy-free that winter and needed the kitchen to swap out half the appetizers. Nobody died from any of it. My mother spent the first 15 minutes of the meal visibly flustered, and at one point, purely out of habit. She glanced toward me with that familiar look on her face, the one that used to mean I would quietly swoop in and untangle the seating and the schedule and the appetizer mix-up all in one smooth motion. I kept talking to Kristen instead, about nothing important, and let that particular moment pass without reaching for it. Eventually, everyone settled. Aunt Paulette laughed about the mix-up once she'd caught her breath and gotten her coat off. My father stopped checking his watch by the time the entrees finally arrived. They adjusted. All of them. The way people generally can when nobody rushes in ahead of them to smooth things over first. I watched it happen almost like an experiment, curious in a detached sort of way about how long the discomfort would actually last if I simply let it run its course instead of intervening. The answer, it turned out, was not very long at all. 20 minutes, maybe less. A slightly bumpy start to a lunch that otherwise proceeded exactly the way every other family lunch had proceeded for years, minus my usual choreography behind the scenes. Nobody seemed to notice the absence of that choreography except me. Later that same week, my attorney confirmed that the long-term use agreement for the house had been finalized, and that the nonprofit was preparing to welcome its first family sometime in the coming month. I drove out to the property one final time before that happened, standing in the empty living room where I had once watched my parents imagine curtains and reading chairs that would never actually belong to them. It still hurt. Standing there. But it was a different kind of hurt than the one I'd carried out of that bakery aisle 3 weeks earlier. Quieter and entirely mine to hold. No longer tangled up in waiting for anyone else's permission to feel it. As I locked the front door behind me for what I expected to be the last time in a while, my phone buzzed with a text from Kristen. Something small and unrelated. A quick complaint about Todd's work schedule falling apart again that month. I read it standing on the porch, thought nothing more of it than a passing detail about somebody else's stressful season, and drove home without knowing yet how much that one offhand sentence would end up mattering before the year was over. The drive back to my apartment took me past the community center where I'd first met Ruth. Its parking lot mostly empty now on an ordinary weekday afternoon. No banners, no crowd. Just an unremarkable brick building doing unremarkable, necessary work. I slowed without quite meaning to. The way you slow near a place that's quietly become important to you. Then kept driving. There would be time to check in properly once the paperwork actually moved. For now, the house was just doing what houses are supposed to do. Standing there patiently, waiting to matter to somebody. I want to tell you that once the house found its new purpose, the rest of that winter settled into something calm. In a lot of ways, it did. I stopped waiting for my phone to explain what my family was doing without me. I started eating dinner without checking 3 group texts first. The version of me who needed to fix every small thing before anyone else even noticed it was broken started slowly to go quiet. But I never forgot that text Kristen sent me on the porch that January afternoon. The one about Todd's work falling apart again. At the time it had felt like nothing. One line buried under everything else I was trying to hold together that season. By the time spring actually arrived in Cedar Rapids, mud season, instead of anything resembling warmth, that one offhand sentence had stopped feeling small. It had started feeling like the beginning of something I hadn't seen coming. The way the first quiet sign of trouble always looks smaller than it actually is until you're standing in the middle of it. Life had gone quiet in the months after that January lunch. Quiet in the specific way it gets once a person stops volunteering for everything and simply waits to see what other people do instead. Spring came and went in the ordinary Iowa way. Mud first, then a few too warm days that fooled everyone into planting tomatoes early, then real, reliable green. I'd started taking a pottery class on Thursday nights. Something I'd never have made time for a year earlier. I'd seen friends I'd been rescheduling for 2 years running. My calendar looked different, less like a schedule built around everyone else's needs and more like an actual life. I had almost let myself believe the hardest part of the year was behind me. Then the alert came through on a Tuesday evening in early June. One of those automatic notifications from the credit monitoring service I'd signed up for years earlier and mostly forgotten I was even paying for. A new inquiry. It said, tied to a line of credit against an account I recognized instantly, even though I hadn't touched it in what felt like forever. Kristen and I had opened that account together back when our mother's hip surgery scared all of us into thinking about emergencies for the first time as adults, instead of as kids who assumed our parents would simply always be fine. We called it the emergency fund, half joking, half serious, the kind of account you set up and then quietly hope you never actually need. I remembered signing the paperwork at a branch downtown, remembered joking with Kristen about which of us would inevitably forget the online password first. She'd guessed it would be her within a year. It had actually been me, twice, though I'd never admitted that part to her. I hadn't logged into that account in years. As far as I knew, it had been sitting untouched, a small cushion neither of us had ever needed to use, a leftover piece of good planning from a version of our relationship that had felt, at the time, uncomplicated in a way it clearly wasn't anymore. I remembered, too, the conversation that had led to opening it in the first place, the two of us sitting in a hospital waiting room while our mother was in surgery, both of us frightened in the specific, practical way you get frightened, when a parent's mortality suddenly becomes a logistics problem instead of an abstract fear. We'd decided, half out of anxiety and half out of a genuine wish to protect each other, that we'd rather have a shared cushion ready than scramble separately if something like that ever happened again. It had felt, back then, like proof that we were the kind of sisters who showed up for each other without needing to be asked. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, scrolling through the notification twice, certain there had to be some kind of clerical error. Banks made mistakes. Systems flagged the wrong account sometimes, especially with names as common as ours attached to a dozen similar accounts across the same regional bank. I checked the account number against an old statement I still had saved in an email folder from years back. It matched exactly. A loan had been taken out against that account, not a large one, not the kind of number that would have triggered any automatic fraud alert on its own, but large enough that it shouldn't have existed at all without both of our signatures on file. I stared at the screen for a long moment, running through every possible innocent explanation I could think of. Maybe the bank had made an internal transfer I didn't understand. Maybe this was some kind of promotional offer that had gotten misclassified as an active loan in the system. I wanted badly for there to be a boring, procedural reason behind that single notification. Something I could resolve with one phone call to customer service and then forget about entirely. But the date on the inquiry didn't line up with anything I remembered doing, and neither Kristen nor I had discussed that account in years. Not once, not even in passing during any of our regular phone calls. I closed the laptop, made myself a cup of tea I didn't really want, and sat with the uneasy feeling that had settled somewhere behind my ribs. Something about the timing nagged at me in a way I couldn't quite name yet. A small, persistent itch of recognition I wasn't ready to look at directly. I decided, sitting there at my kitchen table with the evening going dark outside my window, that before I said a single word to anyone in my family about it, I would look into this myself, quietly, carefully, the way you check a strange noise in your house before you decide whether it's actually something to worry about, or just the building settling the way old buildings always do. Part of me hated how automatic that instinct was, the reflex to investigate alone before involving anyone else, as though I'd learned somewhere over the last 6 months that bringing a half-formed suspicion to my family was a good way to get talked out of trusting my own instincts. A year earlier, I might have called Kristen right then, casually, to ask if she knew anything about it, giving her every chance to explain it away before I'd even looked at a single number myself. I didn't call her. I sat with the tea going cold in front of me instead, and made a mental list of everything I'd need to pull together before I said a word to anyone at all. I gave myself 3 days before I let anyone in my family know I'd seen that notification. 3 days to pull every statement I could access, to lay the numbers out in front of me the way I would for a vendor audit at work, methodically, without letting my own suspicion color what I was actually looking at. I told myself this was still, quite possibly, nothing. A bank error, a mislabeled transaction. Something explainable that would let me close my laptop and go back to my ordinary summer. I took the first of my 3 days off entirely, telling my office I was handling a personal matter, which was true enough not to feel like a lie even though it left out everything that actually mattered. I downloaded 6 months of statements first, then went back further, all the way to the start of the year, printing pages out at my kitchen table like I was building a case file instead of just trying to reassure myself. The account had been quiet for most of the winter, exactly the way I remembered it. Then, starting sometime in February, small transfers began appearing, not dramatic ones, nothing that would have tripped an automatic fraud alert on its own. Amounts just under the threshold that typically required additional verification, spaced out just far enough apart that no single withdrawal looked alarming next to the ones around it. I laid the printed pages across my table in date order and studied them the way you'd study a puzzle you already suspected had a picture you weren't going to like. Whoever had been moving money out of that account hadn't done it once, in a moment of panic or bad judgment. They had done it repeatedly, carefully, over the course of nearly 4 months, in amounts small enough to stay quiet, consistent enough to suggest a plan rather than a series of impulsive decisions. That kind of restraint told me something important before I even knew who was behind it. Whoever this was hadn't been desperate in the way desperation usually looks. They had been strategic. They had been counting on nobody looking closely enough, for long enough, to ever notice. I sat back in my chair and let that sink in for a moment, the kitchen quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing outside. A single reckless withdrawal I might have been able to write off as a lapse in judgment, something forgivable, something explainable in one honest conversation. This wasn't that. This was a pattern, built slowly and deliberately across months, by someone who had access to that account and knew exactly how closely I wasn't watching it. Whoever it was had also known, whether they'd thought about it in those terms or not, exactly how much trust it would take for something like this to go unnoticed for that long. I went back through my calendar next, cross-referencing the dates of each withdrawal against anything I remembered from that same stretch of the year. February was when Kristen had first mentioned, almost in passing during one of our regular calls, that Todd's small business was going through what she called a rough patch, nothing serious, just a slow season everyone in his line of work went through eventually. March was when she'd canceled our usual sisters' lunch twice in a row, blaming a scheduling conflict at the accounting firm both times. April was when she'd asked me, half joking, whether I thought Todd should have gone into a more stable field instead of running his own business, a question that had felt strange at the time and felt considerably less strange now. None of that, on its own, proved anything. But laid next to the timeline of those withdrawals, spaced out exactly the way Kristen's offhand comments about Todd's struggles had been spaced out, the coincidence stopped feeling like a coincidence at all. I sat there at my kitchen table long after the sun went down. The printed statements fanned out in front of me under the overhead light, and understood that whatever I was looking at, I wasn't ready to bring it to Kristen directly. Not yet. Not until I understood the full shape of it myself. Part of what stopped me was simple caution. The same instinct that had once made me quietly research a shelter program instead of promising a stranger a house on the spot. But part of it, if I was honest with myself sitting there in that too quiet kitchen, was something closer to dread. Kristen had been the one person in my family who had actually admitted, out loud, that she'd noticed my absence at Christmas and let it slide anyway. She'd been the one who came to my apartment and told me the truth I'd asked for, even when the truth made her look bad. If the numbers spread across my table meant what they seemed to mean, I was about to lose the one relationship in my family I'd started to trust again, and I wasn't ready yet to find out for certain that I had to. I put the pages in a folder instead of throwing them away, which felt, at the time, like a small act of self-protection. Whatever came next, I wanted it to come from evidence, not from panic, and evidence took longer to gather than panic ever did. I remember standing in my kitchen doorway before I finally went to bed that night, looking back at that folder sitting closed on the table, and thinking about how differently this year had already trained me to handle bad news. A year earlier, I would have called someone immediately, needing another voice to help me sort out what I was feeling before I'd even finished feeling it. That night, I just turned off the light and went to sleep, or tried to, telling myself the folder would still be there in the morning, and so would whatever it turned out to mean. I invited Kristen to dinner that Friday, at a small Italian place near her office that we'd gone to a handful of times over the years, always for something ordinary. A birthday, a decent excuse to catch up between the busier stretches of our lives. I picked it on purpose, neutral ground, familiar enough that she wouldn't read anything into the invitation, close enough to her work that she could come straight from the accounting firm without any extra planning, casual enough that a dinner between sisters wouldn't feel, on the surface, like anything more than a dinner between sisters. She showed up a few minutes late, apologizing, blaming traffic near the interstate, and slid into the booth across from me looking exactly like herself. Tired around the eyes in the particular way people get tired when they're not sleeping well but haven't admitted that to themselves yet, but otherwise unremarkable. Unguarded, the same sister I'd known my entire life. I ordered a glass of wine I didn't especially want, mostly to give myself something to do with my hands while I waited for the right moment. We talked for the first 20 minutes about nothing that mattered. The way you do when you're both circling something without naming it. Her coworker's retirement party, a recipe our mother had botched at the last family dinner. A show we'd both apparently started watching separately without telling each other. It was easy in a way that almost made me second-guess the entire reason I'd asked her here. Easy enough that for a few minutes I let myself simply enjoy having dinner with my sister, the version of her who hadn't done anything wrong yet, or who I still hoped hadn't. I worked up to it slowly, the way you'd ease into cold water instead of diving straight in. I asked about Todd's business first, casually, the kind of question you'd ask anyone. How's it going for him this year? Kristen's answer came a beat too fast, a little too smooth. The kind of response that sounds rehearsed even when the person saying it doesn't realize they've rehearsed it. Fine, she said. Slow season, like always. But fine. Nothing to worry about. She reached for her water glass right after she said it. A small, unnecessary movement that struck me, in hindsight, as exactly the kind of thing a person does when they need somewhere to put their hands after telling a lie they've told often enough to make sound almost natural. I let a silence sit there for a moment before I mentioned, as offhandedly as I could manage, that I'd been thinking about that old emergency account we'd set up years ago, back when Mom had her hip surgery. Just wondering, I said, whether we should finally close it out, since neither of us had touched it in years. I kept my tone deliberately light while I said it. The same tone I'd have used bringing up an old gym membership neither of us used anymore, watching her over the rim of my wine glass without quite letting her see me watching. Something shifted across Kristen's face. Quick, almost too quick to catch if I hadn't already been watching for it. Her hand tightened slightly around her wine glass. She said something about how it was probably fine to just leave it alone. No urgency either way. That closing accounts always ended up being more paperwork than it was worth for something that small. Then she changed the subject almost immediately, asking about a project at my own office instead, steering us both toward safer water with the kind of practiced ease that told me this wasn't the first time she'd redirected a conversation lately. I let her steer. I asked about the project she'd brought up, answered normally, kept my voice light and unbothered for the rest of the meal, even as everything in me was cataloging the exact moment her composure had cracked, however briefly, however small. We ordered dessert, split it the way we always had since we were kids, and talked about our parents for a while. Nothing sharp, just the low-grade commentary siblings trade about the people who raised them. By the time we split the check and hugged goodbye on the sidewalk outside, I had my answer, even though she hadn't said a single word that could be used as proof of anything on its own. Her hug lasted a beat longer than usual, or maybe I only noticed that because I was looking for it. The way you notice everything differently once you've stopped trusting your first read of a person. Kristen wasn't ready to tell me the truth voluntarily. Whatever this was, I was going to have to find it myself, in writing, before I brought it back to her in a way she could no longer deflect. Driving home afterward, I found myself replaying the exact second her hand had tightened around that glass. Over and over. The way you replay a single frame of a movie trying to decide if you actually saw what you think you saw. I hated how certain I already felt. I hated it, because certainty meant I'd already stopped hoping for the boring, procedural explanation I'd wanted so badly a few nights earlier, and had started, instead, preparing myself for something worse, somewhere between the Italian place and my apartment. I stopped rehearsing kind explanations and started rehearsing questions instead, the specific, unavoidable kind that don't leave room for anyone to talk their way around them. The following Monday, I called the bank directly instead of relying on the online portal, and asked to speak with someone who could pull a complete transaction history for the joint account, going back to the day we'd opened it. As a co-owner on the account, I had every legal right to that information, and I said so plainly, without apology. When the representative on the phone hesitated for a moment before agreeing to process the request, she asked, almost reflexively, whether I wanted to note a reason for the request in their system. I told her fraud review, and heard my own voice say the words without flinching, which surprised me more than it probably should have. It took 3 business days for the full report to arrive in my inbox as a secured PDF, 41 pages long, every transaction itemized down to the timestamp. I printed the whole thing at my office on a slow afternoon, closed my door, and read through it line by line with a highlighter in hand. The way I'd review a vendor contract I suspected was hiding something in the fine print. It was the same skill set I used every week at work, and it felt strange, almost surreal, to be turning it on my own sister instead of a supplier trying to slip an extra fee past our accounting department. The picture that emerged was worse, and more specific than anything I'd let myself imagine at my kitchen table 2 weeks earlier. Kristen had used the joint account as collateral on a personal line of credit back in February, without my knowledge or signature, using a loophole in how the account had originally been structured that let either of us pledge it individually for smaller lines of credit under a certain threshold. A detail I'd genuinely forgotten existed until I saw it laid out in the bank's own documentation. The money from that line of credit had gone, in a series of transfers over the following months, toward covering payroll and a supplier invoice for Todd's small landscaping business, which, according to a separate note buried in the account's correspondence log, had been quietly on the verge of collapse since the previous autumn. None of it had been a single desperate decision made in a moment of panic. It had been managed, carefully, for 4 months, timed around each new expense as it came due, always staying just under whatever threshold might have triggered a call to both account holders, instead of one. Whoever had built this pattern had clearly understood the mechanics of the account better than I remembered them myself. And that understanding, more than the dollar amount involved, was what unsettled me most sitting there in my office. I went back over the correspondence log a second time, slower, looking for anything I might have skimmed past the first time through in my hurry to reach the bottom line. There wasn't much to find beyond what I'd already seen. A handful of automated notices the bank had sent to an email address I didn't recognize, apparently set up specifically to intercept anything that might have otherwise landed in my own inbox and given the pattern away early. That detail, small as it was, told me this hadn't been a spur-of-the-moment decision either. Somebody had planned for the possibility of me noticing, and had built in a way to buy extra time before that happened. I sat with that printout in my lap for a long time after I finished reading it, the office around me quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't even particularly surprised anymore. Not after the dinner the previous week, not after watching Kristen's hand tighten around her wine glass the second I'd mentioned the account. What I felt instead was a kind of clarity I hadn't expected. Cold and steady. The same clarity I imagined a piece of hard evidence must feel like to the person finally allowed to hold it after weeks of only suspecting. I had the receipts, actual literal receipts, the exact kind of proof that made an honest conversation possible instead of another round of vague accusations neither of us could fully prove or fully deny. I thought, sitting there, about how different this felt from the version of me who used to avoid confrontation entirely. Who would have found some way to explain this away on Kristen's behalf before she'd even had the chance to explain it herself? I didn't feel the pull to do that anymore. I felt, instead, like someone standing on solid, documented ground for the first time in a conversation that was about to get very difficult. And there was something almost restful about that, even under the circumstances. I closed the folder, set it in my bag, and called Kristen that evening to ask if she could come by my apartment that weekend. I told her it was important. I didn't tell her why. She agreed easily. Too easily, maybe, asking only whether everything was okay in a tone that sounded genuinely concerned rather than guarded. I told her everything was fine, which wasn't quite a lie, and wasn't quite the truth either, and hung up before the conversation could stretch any longer than it needed to. I spent the rest of that evening rereading the 41 pages one more time. Not because I'd missed anything, but because I wanted to walk into Saturday completely sure of every number I was about to put in front of her. Kristen arrived Saturday afternoon, expecting, I think, something closer to a casual visit than what actually waited for her. A plate of something, and an hour of easy conversation before she headed home. The kind of afternoon we'd had 100 times before without either of us thinking twice about it. I had the folder sitting on my kitchen table already. Closed, unremarkable looking. The kind of thing you wouldn't notice unless you already knew what it contained. We made small talk for the first few minutes, about nothing, about the weather turning warm early that year. And I let her settle into the chair across from me before I finally reached over and opened the folder, turning it so the top page faced her. I didn't say anything at first. I just watched her eyes move down the page, watched the exact moment recognition replaced confusion on her face, the color draining out of it in a way I'd never actually seen happen to another person before. Not like that. Not so completely. It took her a full 10 seconds to look back up at me. And in that stretch of silence I could see her running through every possible way to talk herself out of the room she was suddenly standing in. "Vivian, She started, then stopped, her hand pressed flat against the table like she needed something solid to hold on to. I asked her to just tell me the truth. All of it, from the beginning. No softening, no half explanations. And to her credit, once she started, she didn't try to deny what was sitting in black and white in front of both of us. Todd's business had been failing since the previous fall. Worse than either of them had let on to anyone in the family, including me. He'd been too proud, she said, to ask for help directly. And she'd been too afraid of what it would mean, for their marriage and for how the rest of us would see him, to bring it to me the honest way. So she'd found what felt, at the time, like a quieter solution. She'd use the joint account, just temporarily, just enough to cover payroll until things turned around, and pay it all back before I ever had reason to look closely at an account neither of us touched anymore. She talked for a long while once she started, longer than I expected, filling in details I hadn't asked for and probably didn't need. How the first withdrawal had felt like an emergency, a genuine one, the kind that justifies almost anything in the moment. How the second one had felt easier because the first hadn't blown up in her face. How each one after that had gotten a little easier still. The way any repeated behavior gets easier, the less resistance it meets, until 4 months had gone by, and what had started as a single desperate decision had quietly become a routine. She wasn't proud of any of it, she said. I believed that part, at least. I was going to pay it back, she said, and I watched her reach for that sentence the way you reach for a life raft. Like saying it enough times might make it retroactively true. I never meant for it to go on this long, I swear. Vivian, that was never the plan. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I told her that intending to pay something back didn't change what she'd actually done, which was use my name and my credit silently for 4 months, banking on the fact that I trusted her enough not to check. She started crying then, apologizing in a way that felt genuine, even as it kept circling back to how hard things had been for her and Todd. How desperate she'd felt. How she hadn't seen any other option that wouldn't mean admitting failure to the entire family. I believed that she was sorry. I also understood, sitting there across from her with the bank statement still spread out between us, that being sorry and being honest from the start were two very different things, and that she had chosen, repeatedly, over 4 separate months, not to be honest with me. I asked her, once she'd caught her breath, about the email notifications, the ones the bank had been sending to an address that wasn't mine. Her face went even paler at that, if that was possible. And she admitted quietly that she'd set up a filter months earlier, redirecting anything from that account to an inbox only she checked, telling herself at the time it was just to keep me from being bothered by routine notices. Hearing her say it out loud, that specific, deliberate detail, was somehow worse than the withdrawals themselves. A single, desperate decision was one thing. Building a small, quiet system to keep that decision hidden for months was another thing entirely, and we both seemed to understand that at the same moment, sitting there in a silence neither of us tried to fill. I told her I needed time before I decided what came next, not because I hadn't already made up my mind about the account itself, but because I wasn't ready yet to figure out what any of this meant for the rest of our relationship. The parts of it that had nothing to do with money at all. She nodded, gathered her coat from the back of the chair, and let herself out without asking me to reassure her that everything would be fine between us. I gave her credit for that. At least, a year earlier, neither of us would have known how to leave a room without smoothing it over first. I drove to my parents' house 2 days later, still turning the whole conversation with Kristen over in my head, replaying the exact color that had drained out of her face when she saw the folder. I told myself I was going there simply to keep my mother informed, but underneath that, I recognized a quieter hope I hadn't fully admitted to myself yet, the particular kind of hope you feel for things you already suspect won't happen. I wanted my mother to be shocked. I wanted her to sit across from me at her own kitchen table and say something like, "I had no idea," and I wanted the two of us to be united, for once, on the same side of a family problem instead of standing on opposite ends of one. That isn't what happened. I told her everything. The account, the pattern of withdrawals, Todd's business, Kristen's tears at my kitchen table 2 days earlier. My mother listened with her hands wrapped around her own coffee mug, sitting very still in the way people sit when they're bracing for something without wanting to show it. I watched her face do something I recognized immediately, because I'd seen a version of it before, back in that grocery store parking lot the previous December. It wasn't surprise. It was the careful, controlled stillness of someone hearing a piece of news they had already, on some level, been expecting. The specific stillness of a person rehearsing how much of the truth they're willing to admit to before they've even opened their mouth. I knew things were tight for them, she admitted finally, her voice quieter than I'd expected. Kristen mentioned it to me. Back around the holidays, I told her she should talk to you directly, but I didn't want to push. I sat there for a long moment, letting that sink in, remembering, with a kind of dull, sinking clarity, the exact phone call she meant, the one from a week before Christmas, when she'd said, out of nowhere, that Kristen could use the money more than I'd think, and then let the sentence simply drift away under whatever else we'd been discussing that day. At the time, I'd barely registered it. One stray comment buried in a conversation about wrapping paper and last-minute gifts. Sitting across from her now, I understood it differently. She hadn't been making idle conversation. She had already known something was wrong, and she had chosen not to say it plainly, the same way she'd chosen not to plainly tell me the family had already celebrated Christmas without me the year before. Both times, the choice had looked the same from the outside. Say nothing, and let me find out the hard way, on my own schedule, without any warning to soften the landing. You knew, I said. Not quite a question, though it landed like an accusation anyway. She didn't try to argue the point, which somehow made it worse instead of better. She said she hadn't known the specifics, hadn't known about the account or the line of credit, but she'd known enough, and she'd decided, quietly, that it wasn't her place to get in the middle of it. I asked her why staying out of it had felt like the right choice when the thing she was staying out of involved my name and my credit being used without my knowledge. She didn't have a good answer for that. She just looked down at her coffee, the same way she had on the phone the week after Christmas, when I'd first asked her whether she'd known the family was planning to leave me out. I left her house that afternoon without the ally I'd driven over hoping to find. What I found instead was a second, quieter version of the same pattern I'd already lived through once. Someone in my family had known something that could have protected me, and had decided, for reasons that always seemed to make sense to them in the moment, that staying silent was easier than telling me the truth. It struck me, driving away, that I could probably map this same shape onto other moments across the years if I bothered to look hard enough. Small silences I'd never questioned at the time, because I'd had no reason yet to go looking for a pattern underneath them. My mother promised, as I was leaving, that she would talk to Kristen. I told her that was her choice to make. I didn't tell her I no longer expected that conversation to change anything. I sat in my car outside her house for a few minutes before pulling away, watching the porch light flicker on early against the overcast afternoon. I kept turning over the shape of what I'd just learned. The fact that comfortable silence had apparently become something of a family tradition whenever an uncomfortable warning on my behalf was the alternative. My father had been direct, at least, brutal but direct. standing in that grocery store telling me exactly how things were going to be. My mother's version of harm was quieter and, in some ways, harder to defend against because it never announced itself as harm at all. It arrived dressed as discretion, as not wanting to push, as staying out of something that wasn't her place. I was starting to understand that in my family, staying out of it had never once been neutral. It had always been a choice, made again and again, and it had always landed on me. I drove out to see Ruth again the following weekend, mostly because I didn't know what else to do with the particular kind of exhaustion I was carrying that week. The sort that doesn't come from lack of sleep so much as from being the one who keeps finding things out. She was living in the house by then. My house, though I'd stopped thinking of it that way months ago. It had become simply Ruth's place, with a wreath she'd made herself hanging on the front door and a row of potted herbs lined up along the kitchen windowsill that hadn't existed the last time I'd walked through those empty rooms. She'd started a part-time bookkeeping job that spring, something steady, something that let her build savings for the first time in over a year. And she looked, when she opened the door for me, like someone who had finally stopped bracing for the next bad thing to happen. The house around her looked different too, lived in now in a way that had nothing to do with the furniture the nonprofit had originally supplied, and everything to do with the small accumulated evidence of an actual life. A calendar tacked to the wall by the phone, a stack of mail addressed to her by name, a pair of reading glasses left folded on the counter like she'd only just set them down. We sat at her kitchen table, the same one my mother had once imagined placing near the bay window, and I told her, without meaning to at first, everything about Kristen and the account and my mother's quiet confession 2 days earlier. It came out of me faster than I expected, the whole tangled shape of it, and Ruth let me get through all of it without interrupting, refilling my coffee once without asking whether I wanted more. Ruth listened the way she'd listened that first Christmas morning, without rushing to fix anything, without treating my exhaustion like a problem that needed an immediate solution or a silver lining stitched onto the end of it. When I finished, she didn't offer advice exactly. She just said, simply, that blood and trust weren't always the same thing, that she'd learned that lesson the hard way herself, watching which of her own relatives had shown up during the worst stretch of her life and which ones hadn't bothered to call. You get to decide who earns a seat at your table, she said, setting her own mug down carefully. Family doesn't automatically buy it, never has, no matter what anyone tells you. I sat with that for a long moment, watching the afternoon light move across her kitchen counter, and felt something in my chest loosen slightly for the first time in weeks. I hadn't come there looking for permission to set a boundary with my own sister. But hearing it from someone who owed me nothing, who had no stake in how my family sorted itself out, made the idea feel less like an accusation and more like a simple fact I was finally allowed to accept. It occurred to me, sitting there, how strange it was that the clearest advice I'd gotten all year had come from a woman I'd known for less than 6 months. Someone who'd had every reason to be guarded around a stranger who'd shown up once with a pie and a vague offer of help. Ruth had chosen to trust me anyway, carefully, at her own pace. And somewhere in that slow-built trust, she'd become someone whose opinion actually mattered to me. Not because we shared blood, but because she'd never once given me a reason to doubt her. Before I left, Ruth mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that her caseworker had started talking about longer-term housing options for her, now that her income was stable enough to qualify. Nothing was settled yet, she said, but it felt, for the first time in 2 years, like her life was actually moving forward instead of just holding steady against collapse. She said it the way you'd mention good weather, careful not to get too excited about it out loud, as though naming the hope too directly might jinx it. I asked her what came next, practically speaking, and she walked me through it standing in her doorway. The caseworker visits, the paperwork, the slow accumulation of small proofs, pay stubs and references and a savings account that actually held something in it now, all the quiet machinery required to convince a system that she'd earned a permanent address. It sounded exhausting in its own bureaucratic way, and also, somehow, hopeful. Progress that had to be documented to count as real progress. I understood that logic better than I once would have. After a year spent gathering my own version of proof against people who'd been counting on nobody looking closely. I drove home that evening with a clearer head than I'd had in weeks, already thinking through exactly how I wanted to handle the account with Kristen. Not with anger, not with a dramatic confrontation, with paperwork, the same quiet, transparent kind of resolution that had already worked once. With the house. Somewhere on that drive, watching the last of the daylight fade behind the flat Iowa horizon, I stopped rehearsing angry speeches I had no intention of actually delivering, and started, instead, drafting the practical steps I'd need to take, closing the account, setting terms, putting everything in writing so nobody could later claim confusion about what had actually been agreed to. I spent the entirety of the following week doing exactly what I did best at work, treating an emotional problem like a structural one that simply needed the right process applied to it. It was, in its own way, a relief to have something concrete to organize, a set of facts I could actually act on instead of just sitting with the ongoing hurt of it. I called my attorney first, laid out the situation in plain terms, resisting the urge to editorialize about Kristen's motives or my mother's silence, and asked what my options actually were, separate from whatever I felt about any of it. She confirmed what I suspected. As a co-owner, I had every right to close the account outright, and given that Kristen had used it as collateral without my authorization, I also had grounds to formally request repayment on a defined schedule, rather than simply absorbing the loss or waiting indefinitely for her to make it right on her own timeline. She walked me through a few different approaches, some more aggressive than others, including one that would have involved reporting the unauthorized use formally to the credit bureaus, the kind of step that could have followed Kristen for years on paper, showing up on background checks and loan applications long after the money itself had been repaid. I didn't want that, and told her so immediately. This wasn't about punishing my sister into oblivion or teaching her a lesson so severe she'd never recover from it. It was about making sure the exact same thing couldn't quietly happen again, to me or to anyone else in the family, and making sure Kristen understood, in writing, exactly what she owed and by when, with no ambiguity left for either of us to hide behind later. I chose the second option, not out of cruelty, and not to punish her, but because a defined written repayment plan meant this would actually get resolved, instead of quietly lingering as an unspoken debt between us for years. The kind of thing that shows up again at every holiday dinner in the form of a look nobody explains, a tension nobody names, a debt that never technically closes because nobody ever wrote down the terms in the first place. I closed the joint account entirely, cutting off any possibility of it happening again, and worked with the bank and my attorney to draft a simple repayment agreement, an actual number, an actual schedule, 24 months, automatic transfers, nothing left to memory or good intentions. The number itself wasn't enormous, not in the way people probably imagined when they pictured a family betrayal like this one. It was the kind of sum that could genuinely be repaid in 2 years without wrecking anyone's life, which made it easier, in a strange way, to keep the whole process business-like instead of punitive. I sent the finished draft to Kristen by email, along with a short note, not angry, not warm either, just direct, the way you'd send any other piece of paperwork that needed a signature. No preamble explaining my feelings, no space left open for negotiation on the core terms. She signed it within 2 days, without arguing over a single term, without even asking whether the schedule could be adjusted or extended. I think, in a strange way, having something concrete and finite to agree to was easier for her than sitting inside the vague, open-ended guilt of the previous 2 weeks. Guilt with no defined shape and no clear endpoint in sight. A number has an endpoint. Guilt, left alone, doesn't. I suspected she understood that as well as I did. Maybe better, having spent 4 months already living inside a debt that never seemed to resolve itself no matter how carefully she managed it. I didn't feel triumphant when the signed document came back to me. I felt something closer to relief, the specific kind that comes from finally converting an emotional mess into something with edges, something you could actually track and finish. There was a strange comfort in the 24 numbered months laid out on that page, each one a small, achievable proof that this particular wound would eventually close on schedule, whether or not anyone involved ever fully processed the feelings underneath it. My father, when he eventually heard about the closed account from my mother, would call this cold. I understood. By then, that cold was simply the word my family used whenever I stopped absorbing the consequences of someone else's choices on their behalf. Warm, in their vocabulary, had always meant a version of me that quietly covered for people and asked for nothing in return. I was starting to realize I could live with being called cold by people who had never once called it cold when I was the one doing all the covering. I called Kristen once the agreement was fully signed, briefly, mostly to confirm the first automatic transfer date and make sure she had the right account information on her end. Our conversation was shorter and more businesslike than any we'd had in years, and there was something almost merciful about that brevity. Neither of us had to perform forgiveness we didn't feel yet. We just had to get the logistics right, and let the rest of it catch up in its own time. Before we hung up, she said thank you, quietly. Not for anything specific, just a small, general thank you that I chose to accept without asking her to elaborate on what exactly she was thanking me for. My father called 2 days after Kristen signed the repayment agreement, and I knew from the particular clipped way he said my name, 1 syllable, no warmth in it, that my mother had already told him everything, probably in more detail than she'd meant to. He didn't ask for my side of it first, didn't ask a single question about what had actually happened or how I'd found out. He went straight to the part that upset him most, which was not, as far as I could tell, that his daughter had used another daughter's credit without permission for 4 months. It was that I had, in his words, made things official, turned a family mistake into paperwork, dragged lawyers into something that should have stayed between the two of us and been handled quietly, the way our family had always handled things. "You're doing it again," he said, tearing the family apart over money. "First the house, now this," I reminded him, as calmly as I could manage, that I hadn't been the one to use someone else's account without asking, and that closing it down and putting a repayment schedule in writing wasn't tearing anything apart. It was making sure the same thing couldn't happen again, quietly. The next time somebody in the family needed money and didn't want to ask for it directly, he didn't have a response to that beyond repeating, in a slightly different order, that I'd changed. That I used to be easier to be around, that everyone had noticed it. I asked him, since he'd brought it up, what exactly he thought had changed about me. He struggled with that longer than I expected, circling around vague complaints about tone and attitude without landing on anything specific, the kind of criticism that sounds substantial until you actually ask someone to point to a single example. Eventually, he settled on something close to an actual answer, that I used to just handle things without making a whole production out of them. And now everything came with paperwork and conditions attached. I told him that handling things quietly had mostly meant absorbing whatever cost came with them myself, financial or otherwise, and that I'd simply stopped volunteering to do that by default just because it kept everyone else comfortable. He didn't have much to say back to that either, beyond a short, dismissive sound that used to be enough to end a conversation between us, and this time wasn't. What struck me more than his frustration was my mother's silence on the extension call a few minutes later, once he'd handed her the phone the way he sometimes did when he'd run out of arguments. She didn't defend him this time, the way she usually did without seeming to think about it, offering some small correction to soften whatever he'd just said. She also didn't defend me exactly. She just asked, quietly, whether Kristen and I were still speaking, and when I told her we were just differently now, she let out a small breath that sounded almost like relief. I noticed, listening to that breath, how much smaller her voice had gotten since Christmas. Not weaker, necessarily, but quieter, more careful, like a woman picking her way across ice she no longer fully trusted. I didn't know yet whether that carefulness meant she was genuinely reconsidering her own role in everything that had happened, or whether it was simply exhaustion, the natural result of watching her family fracture along lines she'd spent years pretending didn't exist. Maybe it was both. I decided, for the moment, not to push her to clarify which. She asked one more question before we hung up, quietly, almost hesitantly. Whether I thought Kristen felt truly sorry, or just sorry she'd been caught. It was, I realized, the most honest question either of my parents had asked me in months. The first one all year that seemed to actually want an answer rather than a reassurance dressed up as a question. I told her I thought both things could be true at once, that people rarely arrived at genuine remorse without first passing through the version that only exists because they got found out, and that I'd decided it wasn't my job to sort out which one Kristen was feeling right now. My mother was quiet again after that, but it felt like a different kind of quiet than the one she usually offered me. Less defensive, closer to actual thought. The kind of silence that might, eventually, turn into something worth hearing. I didn't try to explain any further, to either of them. I had learned, somewhere over the past several months, that not everyone needs to understand a boundary in real time for it to still be the right one. I ended the call with my father still slightly irritated and my mother somewhere quieter than usual, and went back to the rest of my evening without replaying either conversation more than once. That surprised me a little. Sitting with it afterward, how easily I actually let it go. A year earlier, I would have spent the whole night turning my father's words over, drafting responses I'd never actually send, trying to figure out the exact combination of explanation and apology that might finally make him understand. Instead, I made dinner, washed the single plate and fork afterward, and read for an hour before bed. And the whole exchange simply sat where I'd left it, unresolved, but no longer occupying the entire evening the way old arguments used to. The first automatic payment from Kristen came through exactly on schedule, on the 1st of the month, small and unremarkable on the bank statement, easy to miss if I hadn't been watching for it, along with a short text that read differently than anything she'd sent me in the week since our conversation at my kitchen table. Not another apology dressed up in explanation. Just a simple line, "Thank you for not giving up on me," followed by a second message a moment later. "Todd found steadier work. We're going to be okay." I read it twice, sitting on my couch that evening, and felt something in my chest ease slightly for the first time since that credit alert had first shown up on my phone back in June. I didn't text back right away. I let the messages sit there for an hour, sitting with the small, uncomplicated relief of them, before I finally typed back 2 words, "Glad to hear it," and left it at that. Ruth called me that same week with her own version of good news. Her caseworker had confirmed she was moving forward in the process toward permanent housing, no longer just a temporary placement inside someone else's program, but something closer to a real life she could actually plan around instead of just surviving inside. I could hear, even over the phone, how different her voice sounded from that first Christmas morning. Steadier, lighter, like a person who had finally stopped waiting for the next thing to collapse. She laughed twice during that call, easily, about something small and unimportant, and I found myself smiling at my own kitchen counter just listening to it. I told her about Kristen's first payment and about the 2 small messages that had come with it, and she was quiet for a second before saying she was glad, genuinely glad. No hint of the reflexive skepticism I might have expected from someone who'd been burned by family obligations before and had every reason to distrust a neat, tidy update like that one. That was one of the things I'd come to appreciate most about Ruth. The longer I knew her, she never seemed to need my family's redemption story to validate her own, and she never begrudged me the small, complicated victories along the way. Even the ones that had nothing to do with her directly and everything to do with people who had, at one point, treated her as an afterthought too. I drove out to see my mother that same weekend, mostly just to check in, our visits having settled into something calmer over the past few months. Still not entirely easy, but more honest than they used to be, in the small, unglamorous ways that honesty usually actually shows up. We sat on her back porch with iced tea, talking about nothing important until she mentioned, almost offhandedly, that my grandmother Opal had been having trouble lately. Some confusion about a bill she swore she'd already paid. A late notice that shouldn't have existed given how carefully Opal had always managed her own finances for as long as any of us could remember. "Probably just getting older," my mother said, with a small, resigned shrug. "The kind you give when you've already decided not to worry about something." She's 84. Things slip. I asked whether Opal had mentioned it to anyone else, or called the utility company herself to sort out the mix-up. My mother said she thought so, though she wasn't entirely sure, and admitted she hadn't followed up as closely as she probably should have. Opal had always been so fiercely capable about her own affairs, my mother said, tracking every bill and receipt in a ledger she kept by hand out of pure habit, that none of them had ever really needed to check in on that side of her life, and it hadn't occurred to her yet that this might be the year that changed. I nodded along at the time, filing the comment away the same way you file away most small worries about aging parents and grandparents, a minor concern to keep an eye on rather than an emergency demanding immediate attention. I didn't think much more about it that afternoon, finishing my tea, talking instead about Kristen's repayment schedule and how relieved I felt that this particular chapter finally seemed to be closing on its own. My mother relaxed visibly as the conversation moved away from Opal and toward something with a clearer resolution already in sight. And I let it move that direction too, not yet understanding what I was letting slide past both of us. A small overlooked detail that would take on an entirely different weight in only a few more weeks. It would be weeks before that offhand comment about a late bill stopped feeling like an ordinary detail about getting older, and started feeling like the first thread of something I hadn't seen coming at all. I drove home that evening, thinking mostly about Kristen's text and Ruth's laugh. 2 small good things landing in the same week after a stretch that had felt like nothing but bad ones. And I let myself believe, for a little while, that maybe the worst of the year was finally behind me. I had believed something similar once before, back in January, standing in an empty living room that no longer belonged to my parents. and I would think back on that particular kind of hope more than once before the year was actually over. By late summer, the account with Kristen had settled into something almost routine. A payment landing on the first of every month. A short text from her a day or two later. Nothing dramatic, just proof that the plan was holding. Ruth's paperwork for permanent housing was moving forward too. Slow but steady. The way real progress usually looks instead of the way movies make it look. I thought, honestly, that the hardest part of that year was behind me. But my mother's comment about my grandmother Opal kept surfacing at strange moments. In the middle of a work meeting, in the quiet minute before I fell asleep. Probably just getting older, she'd said, with that small shrug people give when they've already decided not to worry about something. Opal had spent nearly 6 decades as a seamstress, decades of precise measurements, exact figures. A woman who had never once in my lifetime lost track of a dollar. A late bill she swore she'd already paid didn't sound like getting older to me. It sounded like something worth checking myself, in person, instead of trusting a shrug over the phone. Opal's duplex sat on a quiet street on the older side of town, the kind of block where the houses had all been built around the same decade and had aged, mostly gracefully, together. She'd lived there since my grandfather passed, downsizing from the house where my mother had grown up into something smaller and easier for one person to manage. I found her in the kitchen when I arrived that Saturday afternoon, a stack of mail sorted into 3 careful piles on the table in front of her. The same system she'd used my entire life. Paid. Unpaid. Needs a phone call. She looked, at first glance, exactly like herself. Sharp-eyed, steady-handed, wearing the same kind of practical cardigan she'd worn every autumn for as long as I could remember. Lavender that year. Buttoned to the top the way she always wore it, regardless of the actual temperature outside. It wasn't until we'd settled at the table with tea that I noticed the particular tightness around her mouth. The way she kept glancing back toward the mail pile even while we were talking about something else entirely. As though it might rearrange itself the moment she looked away. I made the tea myself, the way I usually did on these visits, finding the same chipped mug I always used tucked in the same cabinet it had lived in since I was a child. There was something steadying about that kind of repetition at Opal's house. The sense that certain things in the world still stayed exactly where you left them. It made the tightness around her mouth stand out even more by contrast. Something wrong with the bills. Grandma, I asked, mostly making conversation, not really expecting the answer I got. Opal set her cup down carefully and told me about a payment she'd sent to the utility company weeks earlier. A payment she was certain, absolutely certain, she'd mailed on time the way she always did. The way she'd been doing without a single missed payment for longer than I'd been alive. And yet a late notice had arrived anyway, followed by a second one a few weeks after that, threatening a fee she'd never once had to pay before in her life. She'd called the utility company herself, she said, sitting on hold for the better part of an hour, and they had no record of receiving her check at all. No explanation beyond a polite suggestion that maybe it had gotten lost somewhere in the mail. I know I sent it, she said, and there was something in her voice I'd never heard from her before. A small, unfamiliar note of doubt about her own certainty. I've never missed a payment in my life. Vivian, not once. I sat with that for a moment, watching her fold and refold the corner of a napkin, a nervous habit I didn't remember her having before. Opal had spent nearly 60 years as a seamstress, first in a factory floor full of other women bent over the same kind of machines, later running her own small alterations business out of the front room of the house my mother grew up in. She had built an entire career on precision, on measurements that couldn't be off by even a fraction of an inch, on hems that hung perfectly level and seams that never puckered. And she had managed her own finances with that same exacting care for as long as I'd known her. A missing check, a late fee she swore didn't belong to her, wasn't the kind of thing that fit the woman sitting across from me. The woman who had once redone an entire wedding dress overnight rather than let a single crooked stitch leave her workroom. "Who's been helping you with your bills lately?" I asked, keeping my voice as casual as I could manage, even though something in my chest had already started to tighten. Opal's face relaxed slightly at the question, like she was relieved to have an easy answer to offer me. "Oh, Neil's been wonderful about it," she said. "He set all this up for me, actually. Said it would make things easier at my age. I don't know what I'd do without him, honestly." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. Filing that name away with a growing unease I wasn't ready to name out loud yet. Not until I understood exactly what I was looking at. We finished our tea talking about other things. The garden she still tended out back despite her knees. A cousin's wedding she was debating whether to attend. And I let the conversation drift wherever she wanted it to go, unwilling to press further before I'd had time to think clearly about what she'd already told me. But driving away from that duplex an hour later, I found myself doing the same math I'd done with Kristen's account months earlier, lining up small, individually forgivable details and watching them add up into something that no longer looked forgivable at all. A missed check the utility company had no record of. A note of doubt in the voice of a woman who had never once, in my entire life, doubted her own precision about anything. A name offered up with total, unquestioning gratitude. None of it was proof of anything yet, but it was enough to make me turn my car toward home instead of my original plan for the afternoon, already thinking through who I could quietly ask about Opal's finances without alarming her in the process. I asked Opal to tell me more about Neil, keeping my tone light, the kind of question you'd ask out of ordinary curiosity rather than concern, careful not to let anything in my face give away why I was actually asking. She seemed happy to talk about him, which told me something on its own. The easy warmth in her voice when she described how attentive he'd been, how thoughtful, how different from some of the other younger relatives who barely called anymore. Neil Prescott was technically her grandnephew, the son of a cousin on her late husband's side, someone I'd met maybe twice at large family gatherings over the years. Always pleasant, always slightly forgettable. The kind of distant relative who exists mostly at the edges of family photographs, never quite close enough to warrant much thought between holidays. According to Opal, he'd started stopping by regularly about a year earlier. First just to help carry groceries in from her car, then gradually taking on more, mowing her small patch of lawn a few times that summer, fixing a leaky faucet she'd been meaning to call a plumber about for months. He worked in financial and insurance consulting, she said proudly, like it was a credential rather than simply a job title. And he'd offered, out of what she described as pure generosity, to help her manage her bills and banking as she got older, since she'd mentioned once, in passing, that the online systems banks kept switching to made her nervous. He set up online access to everything, she told me, gesturing vaguely toward a laptop sitting closed on the counter. One I didn't remember her owning the last time I'd visited. Said it would save me the trip to the bank every month. And he had me sign some paperwork, so he could handle things if I ever couldn't. That last sentence landed heavier than she seemed to realize she'd said it, sitting there in her kitchen with her tea going lukewarm in front of her, entirely unaware of how much weight those few words actually carried. "What kind of paperwork, Grandma?" She waved a hand, unconcerned. "Oh, I don't remember exactly. Power of something. He explained it to me at the time, but you know how I am with all that legal language. It goes in one ear and out the other. She smiled at me, genuinely fond, genuinely grateful. The kind of smile that made the whole conversation feel almost disloyal to be having. He's been such a help. I honestly don't know what I'd have done without him this past year. I kept my own face as neutral as I could manage, nodding along, asking a few more gentle questions about how often Neil visited and whether he'd ever asked her to sign anything else since that first arrangement. Once every week or two, she said, sometimes more if something needed handling. As for additional paperwork, she thought maybe once. A form he'd said was just an update to the first one, though she couldn't say for certain what it had actually updated. Her answers were vague in exactly the way that worried me most. Not because she was hiding anything, but because she genuinely didn't seem to remember the specifics. The way you don't remember the details of a form you trusted someone else to explain to you correctly. The way trust itself can quietly stand in for understanding, without either person ever noticing the substitution. I didn't have anything concrete yet. A vague memory of paperwork. A missing check the utility company had no record of. A grandnephew who had positioned himself, patiently and over the course of a full year, as the one person managing every financial detail of an 84-year-old woman's life, none of it, on its own, proved anything wrong had happened. Plenty of families had exactly this arrangement without anyone ever taking advantage of it. Adult grandchildren or nephews stepping in to help aging relatives with exactly the kind of digital banking that could feel overwhelming to someone who'd spent her whole life writing checks by hand and balancing a paper ledger every Sunday evening. But I kept circling back to one detail that didn't sit right with me, turning it over the whole drive home. The sheer vagueness of Opal's own account of what she'd actually signed. She was a woman who remembered fabric weights and thread counts from alterations jobs she'd done decades earlier. The idea that she couldn't recall even the general shape of a legal document handling her entire financial future felt less like ordinary forgetfulness, and more like evidence that whatever she'd signed had never been properly explained to her in the first place. That clarity had never actually been the point of the conversation when Neil sat her down with that paperwork. But I found myself, before I left that afternoon, asking Opal if she still had copies of her recent bank statements somewhere in the house, and whether she'd mind if I took a look through them with her sometime soon, just to make sure everything was in order. I kept my tone as light as I could manage, framing it as the kind of routine check-in any granddaughter might offer. Nothing urgent, nothing alarming, just an extra set of eyes. She agreed without hesitation, pleased, I think, that I was taking an interest in a part of her life nobody usually asked about, with no idea yet what that interest was actually circling, or how much it would end up mattering in the weeks ahead. I found an excuse to stop by Opal's the following week while her part-time caregiver, a woman named Denise Okafor, was there for one of her regular visits. Denise came by 3 afternoons a week, mostly to help with light housekeeping and to make sure Opal was eating properly. A service my mother had arranged the previous year after a minor fall had scared the whole family into taking her independence a little more seriously than they had before. I'd met Denise a handful of times before, always briefly, always in passing, exchanging pleasantries on my way in or out without ever really talking to her directly. This time, I made a point of catching her alone in the kitchen while Opal napped in the next room. Timing my visit deliberately around the hour I knew Opal usually rested, I asked her, carefully, whether she'd noticed anything unusual lately, keeping the question broad enough that it wouldn't sound like I already suspected something specific. Denise hesitated for a moment. The particular hesitation of someone deciding whether something she'd noticed was actually worth mentioning, or just her imagination working overtime, glancing once toward the doorway to make sure Opal was still resting. Then, Finally, after a long pause, she told me about the mail. She'd noticed, a few months back, that a folder Opal used to keep for incoming bank statements had started arriving empty. Opal had always been meticulous about that folder, sliding each new statement in as soon as the mail came. And its sudden emptiness had been the kind of small detail Denise almost mentioned and almost didn't. When she'd finally asked about it, gently, Opal had mentioned that Neil had arranged for statements to go somewhere else now, some kind of processing address, to make things simpler for him to manage everything on her behalf. Denise hadn't thought much of it at the time. It sounded, on the surface, like a reasonable convenience, the kind of small administrative change families make for aging relatives all the time, the kind of thing nobody questions until they have a specific reason to. What had actually caught her attention, she said, was smaller than that, and stranger. Twice in the past few months, Opal had come to her, quietly embarrassed, asking to borrow a small amount of cash, $20 here, $30 there, for something ordinary, a prescription copay, a birthday card for a great-grandchild, small requests that didn't match a woman who had, as far as Denise had always understood, more than enough saved to cover things like that without a second thought. A woman who had, in fact, once insisted on paying for Denise's own car repair out of sheer stubborn generosity when Denise mentioned it in passing. Denise had chalked it up, at the time, to Opal simply not wanting to make a special trip to the bank for something so small, or maybe misplacing cash somewhere in the house the way people sometimes do as they get older. It hadn't occurred to her to connect it to anything larger. Not until I started asking questions that made the whole pattern suddenly visible in a way it hadn't been before. "She always pays me back within the week," Denise said. "I never thought it was a big deal. But it did seem odd. She's never been someone who runs short. In 2 years of coming here, I'd never once seen her ask anybody for anything. And then suddenly it was twice in one season," Denise added, almost as an afterthought, that Opal had seemed embarrassed both times, apologizing more than the situation warranted for such a small amount of money. The way people apologize when something feels out of character to them, too, even if they can't quite articulate why. That detail stuck with me more than the dollar figures did. Opal wasn't confused about her own habits. Some part of her clearly understood that something about her finances no longer matched the woman she'd always been. I stood in that kitchen for a long moment after Denise finished talking, feeling something cold and specific settle into place. A folder of bank statements redirected somewhere else. At Neil's arrangement, an 84-year-old woman occasionally short on cash for entirely ordinary expenses, despite a lifetime of careful saving. None of it, taken separately, would have alarmed a stranger. Taken together, laid against everything Opal had already told me the previous week, it read like exactly the kind of pattern I'd once read about in a news article in passing, filed away as a distant tragedy that happened to other families, and had hoped I'd never actually have to recognize sitting inside my own. I thanked Denise sincerely for telling me all of it, asked her, gently, to keep it between the two of us for now, and told her I'd be back soon with something concrete that would let me look at the actual numbers instead of just the shape of my own growing, uneasy suspicion. Before I left, I asked her one more important thing, whether she genuinely thought Opal was safe day to day, physically, whatever else might turn out to be happening with the money. Denise didn't hesitate on that one. Opal was eating well, sleeping normally, moving around the house without any trouble, still sharp enough to correct Denise's crossword answers most afternoons. Whatever this was, it hadn't touched her physical care, not yet, and I held on to that small mercy the whole drive home, even as everything else about the situation kept tightening steadily in my chest. Getting my hands on the bank statements took less convincing than I'd expected going in. Oh, Paul. When I gently explained that I just wanted to make sure everything with her account still looked right, agreed readily and without any suspicion, glad, I honestly think. To have someone finally taking an active interest instead of simply trusting that Neil had everything handled without a second look. She signed a simple authorization letter at her kitchen table, her handwriting still steady despite everything. The same careful cursive she'd used my whole life, and I drove it to the branch myself that same afternoon rather than waiting on the mail, worried that any delay might give someone time to notice I was asking. The full report arrived 4 days later. 63 pages of transaction history stretching back over the full year Neil had been managing her accounts. Far more than I'd braced myself for when I requested it. I set aside an entire evening to go through it properly, spreading the pages across my dining table the way I had with Kristen's statements months earlier. Printer paper fanned out edge to edge until it covered nearly the whole surface, though this time my hands weren't as steady as they'd been then, and I noticed it, annoyed with myself for the small tremor in my fingers as I turned each page. The pattern was there almost immediately, and it was worse than anything I'd let myself imagine walking in. Cash withdrawals. Large ones. Several $1,000s at a time, occurring roughly every 6 to 8 weeks since the previous autumn. Each one made in person, at branches. Opal herself had never once visited, according to her own account of her routine. Branches scattered across 3 different suburbs, none of them anywhere near her actual neighborhood. There was no plausible explanation for an 84-year-old woman living quietly on a fixed income, cooking her own meals, mending her own clothes out of habit more than necessity, to have withdrawn that kind of cash. That consistently, for any ordinary purpose I could think of. I tried, sitting there under the kitchen light, to construct some innocent scenario that fit all the numbers in front of me, some generous explanation I could offer Neil before ever confronting him directly. I couldn't find one that held up past the second withdrawal, let alone the 8th or the 12th. I cross-referenced the withdrawal dates against a small calendar of Neil's visits that Denise had, thankfully, started keeping once I'd asked her to pay closer attention after our conversation in the kitchen. The overlap wasn't subtle. Nearly every large withdrawal fell within a day or two of one of his regular stops at Opal's house. The same visits Opal described so warmly, the ones where he sat with her over coffee and reviewed her mail and told her, again and again, how much simpler he was making her life. I counted them twice, certain I had to be seeing a pattern that wasn't really there, hoping my own tiredness was manufacturing coincidences out of noise. Both times the count came back exactly the same. I sat at my table long after midnight with those pages spread out in front of me, feeling something colder and more focused than the anger I'd felt with Kristen months earlier. This wasn't a single desperate person making a bad decision under pressure. This was patient, deliberate, methodical in a way that felt almost professional, spread out carefully enough over nearly a year that it might never have been noticed at all if my mother hadn't mentioned a late utility bill during an otherwise ordinary conversation on her back porch, a detail so small she'd nearly forgotten to bring it up at all. I didn't call Opal that night, and I didn't call Neil either. I wasn't ready yet to move without a real plan in place. Not when the person sitting at the center of all of it was 84 years old and trusted the man doing this to her more than she trusted almost anyone else still left in her life. I thought about Kristen, too, sitting there at my table with those pages spread out under the lamp. My sister had at least been stealing from someone her own age, someone with income and options and the physical ability to fight back if it ever came to that. This was different in a way that made my chest ache every time I let myself sit with it for more than a few seconds. Whoever had built this pattern had chosen, deliberately, the one person in the entire family least equipped to notice it happening, and had counted on exactly the qualities that made her so lovable in the first place: her trust, her gratitude, her fading confidence around anything digital, to keep the whole arrangement running smoothly for the better part of an entire year without a single relative catching on. I finally closed the folder somewhere around 2 a.m, my eyes burning from the desk lamp. The house around me silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the building settling in the cold. I sat for a long moment in the dark kitchen before I forced myself to go to bed. Whatever came next needed a clear head behind it, and clear heads, I'd learned by then, from both this year and the one before it, simply didn't happen at 2 a.m, no matter how much a person wanted them to arrive early. Denise called me on a Thursday afternoon, her voice tight in a way I hadn't heard from her before. Tight in the specific way people's voices go when they're trying to sound calm about something that clearly isn't. She asked if I had a few minutes to talk somewhere she wouldn't be overheard. I stepped out onto my office balcony, phone pressed hard against my ear, and she told me what had happened that morning at Opal's house. I could hear it immediately, even before she got into any of the specific details, that whatever she was about to describe had genuinely rattled her. Denise wasn't a woman prone to overreacting. In the months since I'd started asking her to keep an eye on things, she'd been careful, measured, always willing to talk herself out of alarm before bringing anything to me. This time she hadn't managed that, and the difference in her voice told me almost as much as her actual words would. She'd been in the next room, folding laundry, when Neil called Opal's landline that morning, not realizing Denise was still there finishing up her shift. Opal had put the call on speaker without thinking about it, the way she did with most calls these days. Her hearing not quite what it used to be, and speakerphone simply easier than holding the receiver against her ear for long stretches. Denise hadn't meant to listen. She'd tried at first to keep folding towels and let the conversation wash past her the way background noise usually does. But she had listened, in the end. And what she'd heard had stayed with her clearly enough, word for word almost, that she could repeat most of it back to me over the phone hours later without hesitating once. Neil had told Opal not to worry about that transfer from last week, said he'd take care of smoothing it over with the bank himself, said something about handling it before anyone starts asking questions they don't need to ask. Denise repeated that last phrase to me twice, slowly, making sure I'd heard it correctly both times. Opal, according to Denise, hadn't seemed alarmed by any of it, hadn't seemed to fully register what he was actually saying, or what it implied about how carefully he'd been managing what she was and wasn't allowed to know. She'd simply thanked him, the way she thanked him for everything, warmly, gratefully, and asked if he'd be by again that weekend, already looking forward to it. I stood on that balcony for a long moment after Denise finished. The traffic noise from the street below, suddenly very far away, muffled almost to nothing beneath the sound of my own pulse. It was one thing to have 63 pages of numbers suggesting a pattern I didn't like, numbers that could still, technically, be argued away by someone determined enough to try. It was another thing entirely to hear, second-hand but unmistakable, that the person behind that pattern knew exactly what he was doing, understood precisely how it would look if anyone found out, and was actively, deliberately working to keep anyone from noticing before he'd finished doing whatever it was he still intended to do. That single phrase, "Before anyone starts asking questions they don't need to ask," told me more than the entire 41 pages of Kristen's statements had months earlier. Kristen's betrayal had grown out of panic, badly handled but at least born from something recognizably human. This was different. This was someone thinking clearly, calmly, several steps ahead, treating an 84-year-old woman's trust as a resource to be managed rather than a relationship to be honored. I thanked Denise, told her how much I appreciated her telling me, and asked whether she'd be willing to write down exactly what she remembered hearing while it was still fresh, dates and all, in case it ever mattered later in a more formal way. She agreed without hesitation, and I could hear something in her voice loosen slightly once she'd actually said it all out loud to someone who believed her without needing convincing. I think, by that point, she'd been carrying her own quiet worry about Opal for longer than she'd let on to anyone. Uncertain whether raising it herself would sound like overstepping the boundaries of a job that was only ever supposed to involve laundry and meals, I asked her gently, before we finally hung up, whether she still felt safe continuing to work in that house while all of this remained unresolved between us. She said yes without much hesitation, that Neil had never once been anything but polite to her directly, and that her only real concern in all of this was for Opal's well-being. I believed her. I also made a mental note to move faster than I might have otherwise, because the longer this dragged on unresolved, the more Denise would be forced to carry a secret that wasn't hers to carry. That evening, I called my attorney for the second time that same year about a family member's finances, a fact that struck me, dialing her familiar number once again, as a strange, unwelcome kind of milestone I never would have predicted having to reach twice inside the same 12 months of my life. I told her I needed to understand, as clearly and quickly as possible, what my actual options were when the person you suspected of financial abuse held legal power of attorney over the victim, and how quickly those options could realistically move once we decided which one to pursue. I asked my parents to come to my apartment that weekend, telling them only that it was important and that it concerned Opal, which was enough to get both of them there within the hour. Worry already written across my mother's face before she'd even taken off her coat. My father arrived a few minutes behind her, having driven separately from a hardware store errand, and I could see him doing the same mental math my mother had clearly already done in the car, trying to guess at the shape of whatever news was waiting for them before I'd said a single word. I'd spent the better part of the previous evening deciding how to present everything, running through different approaches the way I would for a difficult presentation at work. Too much emotion up front and they'd focus on my tone instead of the evidence. Too and they might mistake my composure for exaggeration, assume the situation couldn't be as serious as I was making it sound if I wasn't visibly upset about it. I landed, in the end, on something close to how I'd handled Kristen, letting the documents carry the weight instead of my own voice. I laid it out for them the same way I'd laid the evidence out for Kristen months earlier, methodically, without embellishment, letting the actual documents do most of the talking instead of my own emotions about any of it. The pattern of withdrawals, the redirected mail, Denise's account of the phone call, written up and signed with a date beside it. I walked them through the timeline slowly, month by month, watching my father's expression change as I spoke, moving from concern to something harder, more skeptical, the particular kind of doubt that comes from not wanting a thing to be true rather than from any actual flaw in the evidence itself. Neil wouldn't do that, he said, cutting in before I'd even finished laying out the full timeline. He's family. He's been nothing but helpful to your grandmother this whole past year. My mother sat quieter than usual, staring at the printed pages spread across my coffee table without quite looking at them directly. The way you avoid looking straight at something you're genuinely afraid might turn out to be real if you actually let yourself see it. There has to be some kind of explanation, she said, her voice thinner than I was used to hearing from her. Maybe he's just disorganized. Maybe some of this is completely legitimate and just looks strange without the full context behind it. I understood the impulse, even as it frustrated me sitting there watching them both circle around the truth. Nobody wants to believe that someone inside the family circle is capable of doing this to the most vulnerable person in it, especially not someone who shows up regularly, who calls, who seems, on the surface, like exactly the kind of relative everyone else should be more like. I had felt the exact same resistance myself, sitting at my dining table with those bank statements at midnight, wanting badly to find an innocent explanation that would let me close the folder and stop worrying about it. But wanting something to be true had never once made it true. Not in my experience, and I told them that as gently as I could manage without softening the substance of it. "I'm not asking you to take my word for it," I said, keeping my voice level, refusing to let the conversation tip into something more heated than it needed to be. "I'm asking you to actually look at the numbers with me, all of it, page by page, before either of you decides what you believe about any of this." My father crossed his arms, unconvinced, jaw set in the same stubborn line I remembered from the day he'd confronted me at the empty house. But he didn't leave the room, which felt, in its own small way, like actual progress compared to where we'd started that afternoon. My mother reached for the top page of the statement printout. Finally. Her hand hesitating over it for a second before she committed to actually picking it up and started reading it properly for the first time since she'd sat down on the couch across from me. I recognized the shape of what was happening in that living room. The same disbelief I'd faced from both of them back when I first told them about Kristen. The same instinct to protect the family's comfortable version of itself over confronting an uncomfortable truth. It struck me, watching my mother's eyes move slowly down that first page, that this particular instinct probably wasn't unique to my family at all. Most people, I suspected, would rather believe almost anything than accept that someone they trusted had been quietly exploiting the most vulnerable person available to them. I was tired, in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, of being the one who had to prove, again and again, that the people closest to us were capable of causing real harm. Twice in 1 year I had sat in a room with evidence spread out in front of people who loved the person implicated more than they wanted to believe the evidence itself. But I also understood, more clearly than I had a year earlier, that being tired of proving it didn't mean I got to stop. Not when the alternative was letting an 84-year-old woman keep trusting the wrong person with everything she had left. Kristen came by the following evening. At my mother's request, after Diane had called her that same night, still visibly shaken from the afternoon at my apartment, unsure how to make sense of what she'd read on those pages. I hadn't expected Kristen to be the one who ended up walking our parents through the actual math. But she was, after all, the one in the family who did exactly this kind of work for a living, spreadsheets and reconciliations and careful attention to numbers that didn't add up the way they should, watching her lay the figures out for them, patiently, in plain language they could actually follow without getting lost. Felt like watching a different version of my sister than the one who had once used my credit without telling me, a version I recognized from years earlier. Before any of this had happened, I hadn't asked her to come myself. My mother had done that entirely on her own, apparently deciding, sometime in the hours after I left her house, that she needed someone else in the family to help her actually process everything she'd seen laid out on that coffee table. I understood the impulse, even if it stung a little. Watching Kristen step into a role that once would have automatically fallen to me, there was something almost fitting about it, though my sister using the exact skill that had once betrayed my trust to help protect someone even more vulnerable than either of us had been. "Look," she said, sliding a highlighted page across the coffee table toward our father, tapping the relevant line with one finger so he couldn't miss it. This withdrawal, right here, happened the same week as this visit, on Neil's calendar. And this one lines up too. And this one. That's not a coincidence 4 separate times in a row. Dad, nobody's finances work like that by accident. Harold studied the page for a long moment, his jaw tight, one thumb tracing back and forth over the highlighted dates as though rechecking them might change what they said. I watched something in his resistance finally start to crack, not because of anything I'd said the night before, but because his other daughter, the one he trusted implicitly with numbers in a way he'd apparently never quite trusted me, was telling him the exact same thing I'd been trying to tell him for a week straight. We called an elder law attorney together that evening. All 4 of us crowded around my coffee table with the phone on speaker. A colleague my own lawyer had recommended earlier that week. Someone who specialized specifically in cases involving financial exploitation of aging clients. She listened to the timeline we laid out without interrupting. Taking notes, I could hear her pen scratching across paper on the other end of the line, then asked several precise questions about the power of attorney documents and the redirected mail. She confirmed, in careful but entirely unambiguous language, that what we were describing matched a well-documented pattern of elder financial abuse, one she said she'd seen more times than she wished she had over the course of her career. Isolated withdrawals timed to avoid scrutiny, correspondence rerouted away from the victim, a trusted relative positioned as the sole gatekeeper of information, controlling what the victim did and didn't know about her own finances. She recommended we move quickly, and she recommended, firmly, that we not confront Neil alone. Sitting in my living room that night, watching my father finally nod along instead of argue, watching my mother reach for my hand across the couch cushions, the way she hadn't done in longer than I could actually remember. I felt something I hadn't expected to feel in the middle of all of it. Not triumph, exactly. Nothing that clean or satisfying. Something closer to relief. The specific, almost physical relief of finally not being the only person in the room willing to look at something difficult and call it what it actually was. For the first time since that phone call in the bakery aisle almost a year earlier, my entire family was standing on the same side of something, all 4 of us. For once, aimed at the same target instead of at each other. Even Harold, arms still crossed tightly over his chest, jaw still visibly tight, was standing there with the rest of us in that moment, no longer arguing that this couldn't possibly be true, only asking, in a voice quieter than I'd heard from him in a long time, what we actually needed to do next to protect his mother-in-law from a man he'd once called family without a second thought. I let myself sit with that shift for a moment before saying anything else, letting it settle into something I could actually trust instead of something I needed to brace against. It had taken 2 separate betrayals and nearly a full year to arrive here, to a living room where all 4 of us were finally looking at the exact same evidence and drawing the exact same conclusion without any argument standing between us. I didn't know yet whether this particular kind of unity would hold once the immediate crisis passed, whether my father would eventually go back to calling my boundaries cold the moment Opal was safe again and the urgency had faded. But for that one evening, at least, none of that uncertainty mattered nearly as much as simply getting the next steps right for the person who needed us most. We met Neil on a Tuesday evening, at my parents' house rather than Opal's, entirely deliberately, so that Opal herself wouldn't have to be anywhere nearby for what was about to unfold. My mother had told him only, over a short phone call earlier that day, that the family wanted to sit down and talk through some questions that had come up regarding Opal's accounts, careful the entire time not to tip him off to exactly how much we already knew about what he'd done. He arrived looking exactly like the version of himself Opal had described to me, pleasant, a little too polished for an ordinary Tuesday evening, carrying a folder of his own under one arm like he'd anticipated needing to defend something before he'd even walked through the door. He greeted everyone warmly, hugged my mother, shook my father's hand with both of his own the way people do when they're trying to project extra sincerity, and I watched him clock, almost immediately, that something about the room felt different than he'd expected walking in. Too many of us gathered in one place. Too quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't happen by accident. I'd met Neil maybe 4 times in my entire life before that evening, always at the kind of large family gatherings where distant relatives blur together into a pleasant, forgettable haze. Looking at him now, knowing what I knew, I found myself searching his face for some visible sign of what he'd done. Some tell I should have caught earlier. There wasn't one. He simply looked like a man in his 40s in a decent blazer. I was beginning to understand exactly the point. I laid the statements out on my parents' dining table without preamble, page after page in careful order, along with Denise's written account of the phone call signed and dated at the bottom, and asked him, directly and without softening it, to explain the pattern of withdrawals timed so closely to his own regular visits over the past year. His face didn't fall the way I'd half expected it to. Instead, it hardened, quickly, into something closer to indignation. "I'm the one who actually always shows up," he said, his voice rising slightly, color climbing into his face. "I'm the one driving over there every single week, handling her bills, sitting with her for hours when none of the rest of you could be bothered to check in more than twice a year. And this is what I get for it. An interrogation in your parents' dining room. Like I'm some kind of criminal." Kristen, sitting beside me, didn't flinch, her voice level and steady in a way that surprised even me. "Nobody's questioning that you show up, Neil. Nobody's disputing that at all. We're questioning where the money's actually going, and why nobody but you seems to know the answer to that." He didn't have a real answer for that question, not an honest one anyway. He circled instead, the way people do when they don't have the truth on their side, back to how much he'd sacrificed. How little any of us understood the actual burden of caring for an elderly relative day to day. The phone calls, the errands, the hours nobody else in the family had bothered to offer. I noticed a genuinely effective deflection, the kind that might have worked on me a year earlier, before I'd learned to separate someone's real sacrifices from the question actually sitting on the table. At one point, his tone shifted into something quieter and more pointed, a vague suggestion that pursuing this further would only complicate things for everyone involved, that Opal's care could become a lot more difficult to arrange if the family insisted on making this into something official. He said it lightly, almost casually, like a man mentioning the weather, and that casualness was somehow worse than if he'd said it with any real heat behind it. I felt my father go rigid beside me at that, and for the first time all evening, he spoke. "That sounds like a threat to me," Harold said flatly, in a voice I'd genuinely never once heard him use before that evening. Steady and entirely unwilling to be talked out of what he'd just heard. Neil backpedaled immediately, insisting he hadn't meant it that way, that he only wanted to make sure everyone understood how disruptive a formal process could be for someone as fragile as Opal. But the room had already shifted around him, all 4 of us standing without needing to discuss it beforehand, on the exact same side of the table for the first time all evening. My mother told him, gently but without a trace of hesitation in her voice, that the family would be pursuing this formally regardless of what he said next, that his comfort with the timeline wasn't a factor we intended to weigh. He left without another word, the folder still tucked under his arm, his composure visibly cracking somewhere around the front door, and none of us tried to stop him or soften his exit on his way out. Nobody spoke for a long moment after the door clicked shut behind him. My father was the one who finally broke the silence, letting out a long breath and saying, quietly, that he owed me an apology for not believing me sooner. I told him the apology could wait. What mattered right now was Opal, and everything we still needed to do to actually protect her. Our elder law attorney moved quickly once we gave her the go-ahead, filing a formal report with Adult Protective Services the following morning and coordinating directly with Opal's bank to flag the account for review before Neil had any chance to react to the confrontation from the night before. The bank froze further activity on the accounts Neil had access to within 48 hours. Standard procedure, the representative told us. Once a documented pattern like ours was presented alongside a signed caregiver statement and a full year of matching transaction records lined up cleanly side by side. I hadn't realized, going into any of this whole process, how much genuine relief could come from watching a system that was supposed to protect vulnerable people actually do its job efficiently and quickly for once. It felt, after absolutely everything we'd already been through, almost anticlimactic in the best possible way imaginable. No dramatic courtroom scene, no prolonged, drawn-out fight stretching across months, just careful, competent people following careful procedures, exactly the way those procedures were designed to work when someone finally bothered to use them. The legal process itself was slower than the confrontation had been. Methodical in the exact way these things have to be, weeks instead of hours, forms instead of raised voices. Investigators from the Protective Services Office interviewed Opal directly, gently, patiently, over the course of 2 separate visits, spaced a week apart, and interviewed Denise as well, cross-referencing her written account against the bank's own records line by line. Opal, once she understood what had actually been happening to her, moved through something that looked, from the outside, like grief more than anger. The particular quiet sadness of realizing someone you trusted completely had been using that exact trust against you the entire time you thought you were being cared for. I sat with her through part of that first interview, at her request, holding her hand under the table while she answered the investigator's questions, in a voice that stayed steady even when her eyes didn't. She kept apologizing, at odd moments, for not having caught it sooner herself, and I kept telling her, as many times as it took, that this wasn't something she should have caught, that the entire design of what Neil had done depended on her not catching it. The power of attorney was formally revoked within 3 weeks, a process that felt agonizingly slow while we were living through it and impressively fast in hindsight. Replaced, at Opal's own explicit request once she'd had time to think it through carefully, with a joint arrangement naming both my mother and me together, splitting responsibilities so that no single person ever held that much unchecked authority over her life again. My attorney helped draft new safeguards directly into the paperwork this time around, required check-ins on a regular schedule. Transparency requirements neither Diane nor I had any objection to whatsoever, since neither of us had anything at all to hide from the other, and both of us wanted exactly that kind of accountability built in from the start. Neil didn't fight any of it publicly, which surprised me less than it might have surprised me a year earlier, before I understood how these things usually go. People who count on nobody ever looking closely rarely have much appetite left for a real fight once someone actually does look, and looks carefully, he sent one email to my mother, defensive and self-pitying in roughly equal measure, insisting the family had misunderstood his intentions entirely, that everything he'd done had come from a place of genuine care, and then he simply stopped showing up anywhere at all. No apology anywhere in that message, no accounting for where the money had actually gone or what he'd planned to do with the rest of it, just an absence, the same kind of absence that had once defined my own place at a Christmas table a year earlier. Except this time, finally, it was the right person disappearing from the room instead of me. I drove out to see Opal once the accounts were fully secured, once the investigators had finished their work and filed their final report, and found her sitting at her kitchen table with the same 3 careful piles of mail sorted out in front of her, paid, unpaid, needs a phone call. Exactly the same system she'd used my entire life. Except this time the paid pile was noticeably, visibly shorter than it should have been. And I understood, watching her sort through it with the same steady hands she'd always had, exactly how much of her own hard-earned money that particular shortness represented. She didn't cry when she finally talked about all of it, which somehow made the whole conversation harder to sit through than if she had. She simply thanked me, quietly, for not letting it stay a family secret the way so many things in our family had stayed secrets before, tucked away and never named out loud because naming them felt more uncomfortable than living alongside them. We sat together for a while after that, not talking about Neil anymore, just drinking tea in her kitchen the way we always had for as long as I could remember. And I found myself unexpectedly grateful for how ordinary that particular hour managed to feel despite everything underneath it. Not every visit needed to be about what had happened to her, about numbers or investigators or paperwork. Some of them could simply be about being there together, the way family visits were supposed to feel in the first place. A few weeks after everything with Neil had finally settled, I drove out to Opal's on a quiet Sunday afternoon. No particular reason attached to the visit at all, just an ordinary Sunday, the kind that no longer required an excuse or a folder of evidence tucked carefully under my arm before I could justify showing up. Her small house looked genuinely different to me now than it had a month earlier, not because anything about it had actually physically changed, but because I no longer walked through the front door already braced for some new bad thing waiting on the other side. She was in her usual chair by the window when I let myself in, a basket of mending in her lap, needle moving with the same steady, unhurried precision that had defined her entire working life, sunlight falling warm across her hands. I stood in the doorway for a moment just watching her before she noticed me, struck by how ordinary the scene looked, how thoroughly it belonged to the woman I'd always known rather than the frightened, doubting version of her I'd glimpsed over the past few months. Whatever damage Neil had done to her finances, he hadn't managed to touch this. The steady rhythm of her hands doing work she'd been doing since before my mother was born. She asked if I remembered how to hem a pair of pants, and when I admitted I didn't, not really, not beyond the vague basics she'd shown me as a child. She patted the chair beside her and handed me a needle already threaded with matching brown thread, walking me through the process the way she must have taught dozens of apprentices over her decades in the trade, patient, exact, correcting my grip without a single hint of impatience creeping into her voice. My stitches came out uneven at first, too tight in some places, too loose in others, and she simply reached over and adjusted my hand without comment, the way you'd correct a child learning to hold a pencil. We sat like that for the better part of an hour, working in comfortable quiet, the late afternoon light moving slowly across her living room floor, dust motes drifting visible in the low golden beams. "You know," she said eventually, not looking up from her own work, needle moving in and out of the fabric without pause. "Your grandfather used to say family wasn't about who shared your blood. It was about who showed up when things got hard, and who you could trust to tell you the truth, even when the truth wasn't easy for anyone in the room to hear. I kept my eyes fixed on the uneven stitches I was still making, letting her words settle fully before I said anything back to her. "I think about that a lot lately," I finally said quietly. "I know you do, sweetheart." She reached over and patted my hand once, gently, her fingers still steady despite everything she'd been through that year. "You've had quite a year of it, haven't you? Proving that exact thing to more people than just me." I hadn't told her much about Kristen, or about the family lunch, or about any of the smaller, quieter ways I'd spent the past 12 months learning where my own boundaries actually needed to sit. Boundaries I hadn't even known were missing until I started building them one at a time. But she seemed to understand all of it anyway. The way grandmothers sometimes understand things nobody's bothered to explain to them directly, absorbing whole seasons of a person's life through small details other people would have missed entirely. We finished the pants together as the light outside started to go gold and low, the hem finally even enough to pass her inspection, though she noted, kindly, that I still had a long way to go before I could call myself any kind of seamstress. She thanked me before I left, not for the sewing and not exactly for the intervention with Neil either, though I knew from the weight in her voice that she meant that too. Underneath everything else she was saying, she thanked me simply for being the kind of person who noticed when something was wrong in someone else's life and didn't look away from it just because looking away would have been so much easier for everyone involved. I drove home that evening with the particular kind of quiet that comes after a long fight finally ends. Not triumphant. Not even entirely at peace yet. But steady in a way I hadn't felt since long before that Christmas morning almost a year earlier. The road home ran past the community center where I'd first met Ruth, past the turn toward my parents' street, past the exit that would have taken me to the empty house that wasn't empty anymore, a year's worth of small, hard-won victories, scattered across an ordinary map I drove almost every week without thinking twice about any of it. I thought about my grandfather's line the whole way home, the one Opal had passed down to me that afternoon. Family being about who showed up and who told you the truth. I hadn't known him well. He'd died when I was young, leaving behind mostly second-hand memories assembled from other people's stories. But sitting with that sentence now, turning it over the way Opal turned over her own careful stitches, I understood exactly why she'd chosen to hand it to me on that particular afternoon, in that particular year. A full year had passed since I stood in that bakery aisle deciding between two desserts for a Christmas that had already happened without me, and it took the whole length of that year, and 3 separate people I loved, to teach me the same lesson from 3 different directions. Ruth had moved into permanent housing that autumn, a small rental 2 towns over, close enough that we still saw each other most weeks. Close enough that her bookkeeping job had turned into something closer to a career, steady hours, a manager who actually valued her. The wreath she'd hung on the door of my old house had come with her to the new one, a little more worn now, still hanging exactly where she could see it every time she came home. She had stopped being, in my mind, the woman I'd handed a pie to on the worst Christmas of my life. She was simply Ruth. Someone whose number I called when something good happened, not just when something fell apart. Kristen finished her repayment that same season, the final automatic transfer landing on schedule. No fanfare, no dramatic conversation about it, just a number finally reaching 0. Our relationship had changed shape since that afternoon at my kitchen table. Not broken, not the same either. Something more honest than it had been before, built on the understanding that we could disagree, even fail each other, and still choose to stay in each other's lives on purpose instead of by default. My mother called more often than she used to, and asked questions now instead of assuming answers. Small things, what I actually wanted for my birthday instead of guessing, whether I had plans before inviting me somewhere instead of after. It wasn't a complete repair. Some conversations still carried an old, careful distance neither of us had fully closed. But she had stopped performing a version of family that required my silence to function. And that, more than any single apology, felt like the beginning of something real. My father and I remained the most unfinished part of that year. He hadn't become cruel again. Not since that evening confronting Neil, when I'd watched something in him shift permanently toward believing me instead of doubting me first. But he also hadn't fully closed the distance his own words had opened in that grocery store bakery aisle 12 months earlier. What he'd actually lost, I think, was his old confidence that I'd keep returning no matter how he treated me, and adjusting to life without that guarantee seemed to cost him more, in the end, than losing the house ever had. Opal remained safe, her accounts quiet and orderly again, her mail arriving where it belonged. Neil, nothing more now than a name nobody brought up at family gatherings anymore, an absence too obvious to need any explaining. She still sewed most afternoons, still corrected my stitches whenever I visited, still told me, every time, some version of the story about my grandfather and what he used to believe family actually meant. I never got tired of hearing it. I suspected I never would. Denise still came by 3 afternoons a week, though her visits had shifted, gradually, from something arranged out of necessity into something closer to genuine friendship. Opal had started teaching her to sew, in exchange for nothing beyond company. And I like to imagine the two of them building something neither of them had exactly been looking for when all of this began. A friendship that had grown directly out of the wreckage Neil left behind. My own life had widened in ways I was still getting used to describing out loud. I'd kept the pottery class going through the winter, badly, cheerfully, producing a shelf of lopsided mugs I refused to throw away out of some stubborn pride in having made them myself. I saw friends I'd spent years rescheduling, actually saw them, instead of canceling at the last minute because something at my parents' house needed managing. The empty spaces in my calendar that had once felt like failure had become, slowly, something closer to room to breathe. When Christmas came around again, I wasn't going to my parents' house, and I wasn't avoiding it either. There was no boycott in it. No statement I needed anyone to receive. I was simply going where I had already chosen to be. Ruth and I hosted a small dinner together that year. Opal driven over by my mother that afternoon, a handful of friends who had become, over the course of one long, difficult year, something closer to family than blood alone had ever guaranteed. When I walked through the door that evening, carrying dessert, the same gingerbread cake I'd once carried into a bakery aisle a year earlier, the memory came back clean and sharp for just a moment. The fluorescent lights, my mother's silence, my father's voice telling me everything was easier without me there. Then I looked past that memory into the room in front of me, warm and a little loud, and saw my own chair already waiting. A napkin folded beside the plate, a seat nobody had to save for me because nobody had ever considered leaving it empty. I hadn't earned that chair by proving anything, or fixing anything, or being useful enough to deserve it. I was simply there, and somebody had planned for me to be, without needing a reminder, without needing me to ask. That was the entire difference. The one it had taken a full year and 3 separate people to finally teach me. I wasn't needed in that room. I was wanted in it, and I understood, at last, exactly how much of my life I'd spent mistaking one for the other, how long I'd let the first stand in for the second because nobody had ever shown me what the real thing actually looked like from the inside. My phone buzzed once, early in the evening. A text from my mother, "Merry Christmas." It read, "Wishing you a night surrounded by people who really see you." 12 months earlier, she would have simply asked when I'd be arriving at her house. The gap between those two kinds of messages was only a sentence, a handful of words rearranged, and it felt. Reading it there in Ruth's warm, noisy dining room. Larger than almost anything else that had happened all year. I typed back a short thank you, meaning every letter of it, set the phone face down on the table, and turned my attention back to the cake, to the people around me, to the whole loud, imperfect room that had already made space for me long before I'd ever walked through its door.